Despite our bias for bad news, it is hard to deny that we live in the best time in human history. Two of the reasons for these are technology and globalization. Technology has empowered individuals more than ever before, and globalization has connected us to the world with all the benefits that these deeper interconnections carry. So it's kind of ironic that one of the major geopolitical crises of our times has technology at its heart and is created partly by the unintended consequences of globalization. Now, most of you might vaguely have heard that there's some problem with semiconductors. You would have heard a mention of China, Taiwan, US, COVID, and you might have thought that it's some arcane economics or tech problem, the geeks will figure it out. Well, no, it isn't quite like that. There's a crisis brewing that affects the whole world, and that has semiconductors at its heart. If you care about the state of the world, then let me tell you, you should care about semiconductors. Listen to this great conversation to figure out why they matter.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Varma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. My guests today are Pranay Kotasane and Abhiram Manchi, who have just written a wonderful book called When the Chips Are Down. Both of them have worked in the semiconductor industry and care deeply about public policy. This is Pranay's 12th appearance on the show, and Abhiram makes his debut. Now, what's a funda with semiconductors? Here are two things to note. One, you need semiconductors for almost every piece of technology you use. One modern car can have up to 3,000 semiconductor chips in it. Two, semiconductors are deeply complex, and the supply chain of a semiconductor chip involves many processes, many countries. An iPhone, for example, has more than 200 suppliers from 43 countries across 6 continents. And for some of these parts and processes, just one country or even one company can give you what you want. So if any part of the supply chain breaks down, everything comes to a halt. Well, during COVID, multiple parts of it did break down. And even though COVID is over, we are in a world where the geopolitics is getting kind of risky and many parts of that chain are vulnerable. This is crazy complicated. There's a lot at stake, and all the big battles of our times, starting with USA versus China, have a strong semiconductor element to it. Pranay and Abhiram break this down beautifully in the superb book and in this conversation with me. But before we get to it, let's take a quick commercial break. Hey, the music started and this sounds like a commercial, but it isn't. It's a plea from me to check out my latest labor of love, a YouTube show I am co-hosting with my good friend, the brilliant Ajay Shah. We've called it Everything is Everything. Every week, we'll speak for about an hour on things we care about, from the profound to the profane, from the exalted to the everyday. We range widely across subjects and we bring multiple frames with which we try to understand the world. Please join us on our journey and please support us by subscribing to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Amit Varma, AMITVARMA. The show is called Everything is Everything. Please do check it out. Pranay and Abhiram, welcome to The Seen and the Unseen.
Thanks, Amit. Great to be back on TSTU.
Thank you, Amit. Thank you for having me here.
Wonderful. So, I've done many episodes with Pranay, and my loyal listeners will be very familiar with his life story and his thinking and his absolutely clear mind, which everyone is in awe of. But Abhiram, the first time I'm coming across you in any form, we've never met, etc., etc. So I'd like to, start by knowing a little bit about you. Tell us a bit about your background and so on and so forth.
Okay. So I am Abhiram Manchi. I am from Andhra Pradesh, particularly I was born in Hyderabad, but my father had a transferable job. So I've been to most parts of India, all over India we've stayed. But primarily my education has been in Tamil Nadu. So right since kindergarten within Tamil Nadu, we've been roaming around, mostly in Chennai. And there's another place called Karur, where I stayed for a few years. And my engineering background, I did in electronics, and that was from Shastra University, which was again in Tamil Nadu. But meanwhile, my parents have been roaming around, and we've stayed in Chennai, Hyderabad, Delhi, some place near Varanasi, Visakhapatnam, and right now everyone is in Bangalore. My father is retired right now. He's just working as a kind of like a banking consultant, as an insolvency resolution professional, exactly. And I have one sibling. he is also working in Bangalore. He is working in Aditya Birla Fashions. Yeah, so that is overall.
Wonderful. And right now you're in Boston University?
Yes, I am currently pursuing my MBA, primarily focused on strategy in Boston University. I just started, I think, 2 months ago. Till then, I was also in Bangalore. I was working for a top semiconductor company, which focused on automotive chip. So I worked there for around 5 years, and I was thinking of just continuing that with an MBA.
Wonderful. Tell me a little bit about how you got into semiconductors in the sense of through your education pathway. Was it kind of serendipitous or were you particularly fascinated by it? And if so, why? Tell me a little bit about, how that journey was for you.
So I would say it was more of luck rather than anything else. So I did my electronics and communication from Shastra, and we had multiple different avenues to get into when you're in electronics. And the advantage of being in electronics is you can actually jump into computer science as well. So that is what most people do. But I was kind of passionate about being in electronics. So, but I couldn't get any role while in college. So on-campus placements. I couldn't get anything, so I went into a data analytics company. It's in Bangalore. While I was working there, a few of my friends who had actually gotten into semiconductors, they referred me back here. And then I think I stayed in the data analytics company for like 4 or 5 months, and once I got the chance, I moved back here. And from then, I've stayed in the same company. It was Cypress Semiconductors back then. It was a US based company, Silicon Valley based, but then it got acquired by Infineon Semiconductors. That's a German based company. So last 3 years from 2020 onwards, I had been working for Infineon. But basically the same role, just the company name changed.
And my next question actually ties in with a quote I just read today. I saw this great interview of Ilya Sutskever from a few years back. He is, of course, the original Brutus in this whole OpenAI rebellion, which started. Great fun story. And he was talking about how he worked in Google in deep learning. And at one point in circa 2014, he got an email. He doesn't say from whom, but probably from Elon Musk, inviting him to dinner with Elon, Sam Altman, and Greg Brockman. And that's where he went and he met them, and he found it really exciting. And his reason particularly interested me, and his reason was that when you work in research, very often you are solving really small problems. You are solving the next small problem and then the next small problem and so on, and you don't get the chance to sit back and to take kind of a broader view of your field or the work or whatever. And he realized that with these guys he would be able to sit back and take that broader view, to not just think about the next specific narrow problem that AI could solve, but think about AGI and the implications and so on and so forth. And it strikes me that maybe up till 100 years ago, within science, within any of the academic fields or technical fields, you could have done that, where every specialist could also have taken the broader view. But today, more and more, you get pushed into silos and so on and so forth. And especially the beautiful way in which you guys have described the semiconductor industry here is how it got more and more specialized and more complex and more intense. And therefore it strikes me that if you're actually working making semiconductors or designing them, you are actually a specialist in a very narrow kind of path, and you don't get a chance to take the broader view. And I want to ask you, first you, Abhiram, but then Pranay also, about whether the broader view was part of how you sort of looked at the field. Because after Abhiram, after all, you did do the GCCP at Takshashila as well, so I'm guessing from that your interests are wider. You want to kind of make a difference. So tell me a little bit about how your thinking about semiconductors sort of evolved. Like, were you a narrow domain specialist to begin with, but then you began to see the bigger picture, or were you always a big picture kind of guy, just doing things which interested you?
Yeah, so specifically talking about the kind of work that I did, it was extremely narrow domain. So it was my work essentially handled supporting third-party software to be used by internally in my company. It involved creating like multiple different flows and creating software. So very, very specific work. And I mean, while I was working there, I knew what I was doing, but the issue was that I didn't know where exactly it fit into the overall grander picture. I mean, I was just trying to optimize overall the efficiency of getting a chip out faster. But I couldn't feel I couldn't get the overall broader picture, and you know, it felt that I was just one small cog in the overall wheel, and that is when I started thinking about the broader picture. And in the general sense, I'm very passionate about semiconductors and technology in general. So once I started working there, I when once you get deep into it, you kind of look at the all the aspects of it, and whatever we take for granted here, your mobile phone, your credit card, and everything, you kind of see the amount of effort that actually goes into it. So once you see that, you will become very fascinated, and that sent me down into a rabbit hole. I wanted to figure out the industry in general, how it grew, and that pushed me towards the broader picture. I want to know, like, why is it the way it is? How did this particular kind of architecture in a chip come into place? So, kind of tracing back the history. Once you go back through history, I think you will end up covering a broad range of topics, and what started out as a very general theme becomes more and more specialized, like you were also telling, like we also mentioned in the book. So when you go back to the beginnings, it was all very broad, basic, very simple, and from there you kind of see how the story evolved. So that fascinated me. I mean, kind of understanding how the broader picture worked out and how it all became silos. So yeah, I had an interest in understanding the broader picture, but I started from the narrow down and went up there.
Yeah, and one of the beautiful things about your book is that you tackle not just the what but also the why. So every stage of the way, including when you describe the science of the chips and so on, you get a sense of the why also. Everything makes sense. Everything is there for a reason, and I would expect that in a geopolitical and economic sense, but even in the scientific sense. And I found that sort of as a layperson really illuminating. Pranay, what is your sort of take on this? You have worked in semiconductors, according to your extremely modest bio. For you've been a chip design engineer in two Fortune 500 companies, and towards the end of the book, you talk about how India's strategic strength is now going to be in chip design. So you have a backup career, I guess you can go back to that. But tell me about how you got into semiconductors, and if you have any takes on what I just asked Abhiram as well.
Yeah. No, yeah, I don't have a career there because it's 10 years ago that I was working there. The world has moved on. But very interesting things. For me, electronics sort of always fascinated. Like, my first fascination was with the TV. I think for many of us, it will be like how wonderful of an appliance that is, right? I mean, and I was always fascinated, like, how is the TV, how does it work? How is it that those signals are reaching us and we are able to see those pictures which are converted into some electronic signals? They travel so far and then they get converted into human beings that you watch on TV. Like, how the hell does this happen, right? So that was sort of always a fascination. And right after 11th, 12th, I had decided that I will try to understand this and go into electronics. So I took that by choice and I always wanted to learn. I never got very good at it, but I was always fascinated by it. So always wanted to learn. And you know that the Clark's adage, right? That any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. For me, it always meant the IC, the chip, the semiconductors. That was the pinnacle of that statement to me. So I was always interested in that angle. But when I joined after my engineering, I joined a semiconductor company, started doing work there. The good thing was that the firm that I was working at was an MNC, Texas Instruments, and it started work in India. It was the first MNC in Bangalore, right? So you can literally say even Bangalore is Silicon Valley because the first company was about semiconductors, not about software as such, right? And it started in 1985. So by the time I joined in 2007, there was 22 years of ecosystem building in that, right? So the work that was happening there was quite good. It was not just that there was some really old back-end work which was being passed over to India, but really good chip level architecture work also happening. So that gave me a chance to meet very interesting people who were thinking broader. They were not just thinking about the small little work that they were doing. So that was an interesting experience, meeting people who are writing papers in this or interacting with others. And one thing that struck me particularly was how what we are taught in college is very different from what is actually done in the companies. So I was very interested in that, and that gave me the teaching kida. And I said, okay, I want to actually go back to my college and tell students how the work atmosphere and the learnings there differ from what we are taught in college and the concepts that you will require when you go there. So I was teaching, went back to my college, taught this a couple of times. So I was interested in the broader impact of this area. And then, of course, I changed tracks after 7 years. I thought after 7 years, I've had enough of this field. I've learned a lot, but now let me try something different. And that's when public policy and Takshashila happened, and so on and so forth. So that was sort of my interest in this. But semiconductors, after joining public policy, sort of forgot, right? Like, I mean, that was at the back of my mind, but I gotten into many, many more interesting things. But 2019 was when it started changing. So 2019 was, so when Trump came, first there was a restriction against a Chinese company called ZTE in 2017. So basically they said that American companies can't supply certain kinds of chips to ZTE in 2017. And then the same thing happened in 2019 against Huawei. And when it happened twice, then I thought, okay, there is something interesting brewing here, that semiconductors, which is like, no one used to talk about it. Even when we used to talk about the word technology, no one mentioned the word chips or semiconductors. It was always about software, right? So this was thought to be a commodity which no one cared about. But suddenly this was at the forefront, right? And it was very fascinating for me to understand how something which was considered a commodity is now being talked about in the geopolitical realm. And I was working on foreign policy. So, I mean, this was made for me, right? Like, I'm in semiconductors and there's geopolitics happening in me. So I said, okay, let's deep dive and understand this better. So since 2019, I wrote first about this in 2019, then tried to convert it into a sort of a course that we taught at Takshashila. That's when Abhiram joined that cohort, and that's when we met. And while in the last slide of the course was that I hope that we can actually write a book on this. Is there anyone who's interested? So Abhiram said, oh, I'm interested. And that's how we started collaborating. By the way, we've met only once in person. So I have met RSJ more number of times than I have met Abhiram. But over the last 2.5 years, we've interacted every Monday, 9 p.m. online, discussing the book. And through that collaboration over 2.5 years, we've been able to write the book. So that's how it's been.
Yeah, I find it fascinating. So you've met Abhiram less times than you've met your other co-author RSJ, and I have met RSJ more than you have met him. So it's like, what's going on here, man? You should kind of go out a little bit more, party shatty, meet people. I also, like the mention of Texas Instruments. Two of the heroes of your book, Maurice Chang and Richard Chang, respectively, in Taiwan and China, did interesting things in the semiconductor world. So maybe here's another Texas Instruments alumni who might do things for India, who can say, and it's this is old saying. Is it a saying or am I imagining it? That you can take a man out of semiconductors, but you can't take semiconductors out of a man.
Yeah.
And like you said, you must have thought
saying by Amit Verma.
Yeah. No, I mean, you must have thought that, fuck, bahut ho gaya semiconductor, I'm out of it, I'm in public policy. And before you know it, hey, it's all semiconductors again. So before we actually start talking about semiconductors, one final question, which is not even so personal, but more about the process of writing the book and so on. Like, I find it really fascinating to talk to co-authors and, discuss how they write the books that they do. For example, the first time I read In Service of the Republic by Vijay Kelkar and Ajay Shah, I knew that everything is is actually written by Ajay, because it's exactly his voice. Though the ideas are both of them, and it was a very collaborative process, and Ajay has described it to me in great detail. Similarly, you and RHJ also kind of chatted a bit about what your process was. How did you two kind of, sort of manage that, especially because one of you was a teacher in a sense, and the other one was kind of a student? And how do you divide the writing? How do you sort of divide the research and so on and so forth? How does that, all of that take shape?
Yeah, I'll begin, and Abhiram, you can add in. But our process was, first we sort of discussed what will the chapters be like. And Amit, what we initially wanted to do was actually put a lot of this book as it is being developed into the public domain. So we started with an obsidian vault where we started putting all the things that we are discussing in. And this guy Amit Verma, he has said perfection is the enemy of production. So we took that very
Yeah.
seriously. I don't know if you know that guy, but
I was quoting Vinay Sitapati. He said it to me on my
but
podcast. Yeah, yeah.
I really, what we were doing is we also had a newsletter. So I was trying to write about this every 10-15 days. So all this book was sort of one outcome of all the writings that we've been doing over last since 2019. So uh, putting things out into the public domain was a really important part, and then putting this into a shared obsidian vault also helped. So we were collaborating on that. Eventually, we didn't make it public, but we started doing a lot of work and sharing ideas there. Simultaneously, once we then broadly discuss what the structure of the book is going to be, then we started working on the chapters separately, and a lot of history of how the semiconductor industry developed, how the US came into the picture, how South Korea came into the picture. That is all done by Abhiram. He was really interested in the historical element of it. So once he'd written sort of the first chapter, I thought, like, your voice is much better than mine in this, and I am not good at looking at history and trying to draw a line through various elements. I'm not, that's not my strength. So I focused on the framework bit, the frameworks in the last chapter, and trying to understand why India didn't get to where other countries could, or what were the reasons why China's first attempts at semiconductors failed, but now they are a significant power in this, right? So the comparative analysis between USSR, US, China, India, those kinds of insights were what I was interested in, and Abhiram was interested in the historical angle. So we play to our strengths, just like in semiconductors where there is comparative advantage based specialization. We did the same here. And yeah, meeting every week sort of helped. So every week we exchange notes that, okay, this is the new thing I have learned in this chapter. And then we would discuss, okay, how this could fit into our book. And that's how the process sort of progressed.
And would the weekly meetings put a pressure on you guys to kind of perform? Because then would you feel that every week that I have to have something, I have to have sat down and done something? Like Abhiram, especially for you, I guess you haven't written in the past as much as Pranay would have, in the sense, not just Pranay's book, but
Yeah.
he's a regular newsletter writer, articles, papers, etc., etc. In your case, how was that process of firstly finding the discipline to be able to write regularly for a big project like this, and also in terms of finding your writing voice, honing the craft? Were there any models that you looked up to कि ऐसे लिखना है? And by the way, I find the whole book delightful, but especially the historical parts, because I think what makes a book really relatable is the stories in the book. So it really works for me in that sense. So well done. But how did you arrive? Tell me a bit about your process, Abhiram, of kind of arriving at the voice, at the discipline, at a picture of the book in your head as it formed.
Okay. First of all, thank you for that. So before the book, I think I had very, very limited writing experience. I think the first time I had sat down to write something was while doing the GCTP course only, where there was one assignment where it was like you have to write something and share it with the public, so that it's not just about learning; it is about disseminating information you have also. That is when I started writing. And I found that I enjoyed the process of doing the research for the writing. Let's say it's 1,000 words, it will take me 2 or 3 hours to write, but the research behind that, it would lead me down into so many rabbit holes. Like you say, I started double clicking on everything. and kind of understood the whole process. But I would generally start out with one small theme. Um, Whatever I was writing about, for example, we take one chapter. I break down the chapter into different parts, basically where it started. Let's say that is the theme of it, and then I'll start researching overall, and I'll collect huge amounts of information on that. And like in Obsidian Vaults or any other place, I'll just store all that information. And one thing I would do is I just take a step back and try to read everything that I've researched and see if there is a narrative forming which connects to the overall arc that we are trying to see. Or if it doesn't connect, how do we have to change the arc to actually match what is there. Yeah, so that was my overall process. Just start with something small and have evidence, research backed evidence over it, and start building it, and eventually reach a story which matches what we want. And other than that, the weekly meeting actually helped me a lot because uh, other than the course that I've done, I don't have much experience in geopolitics. And my only knowledge was how a chip works internally. So I knew the industry as such. I knew what was coming from where. I mean, you worked there for 5 years. I kind of understand where your chips are going, where your work is going. But I had to build that rhythm to look at it from a geopolitical lens, and Pranay helped me out a lot on that aspect. Every week we used to discuss, I mean, depending on the chapter, we used to discuss what the country has done and why it is doing exactly that, what would be their motivations. This was something that didn't come naturally to me, and all these discussions helped. And obviously, because we had it every week, it put me in a place where I forced myself to write a lot and research a lot. There would be a lot of rewrites, obviously, and I had to make sure I had enough content to show what I had done for the week, and there must be some significant progress over the week. So it gave me a kind of schedule and trying to think about it a broader perspective, which is what Pranay was really good at. He would help me, break apart a problem into different parts and looking at it from different lenses. I mean, that was something that it was not coming naturally to me, basically. So it helped out.
My final question before I get to semiconductors is actually about knowledge, in the sense that, of course, you guys use Obsidian, which is an awesome software. I use Roam Research, which is kind of similar with this nested entries, and it has bidirectional linking as well. So these are great tools for knowledge management. I often say Roam changed the way I work completely. But I'm also thinking in a sense of not just assimilating and organizing the knowledge that you get, but also growing that knowledge by constantly iterating and doing things with it. For example, I found that very interesting what you said, that you created an Obsidian Vault first as a way of thinking aloud, even if you never made it public. But I've heard from other writers that when they write a book, they'll actually first workshop it in newsletters. And for some it might be the other way around. That I had an episode with Luke Burgess, who wrote the book Wanting on René Girard's philosophy of mimetic desire. And what Luke told me was that he started his newsletter after the book because he wanted to continue down these ideas. And what I'm thinking is that often we get trapped by this tyranny of form, where we imagine that a book is the ultimate form of knowledge and you've done the book and that's your last word on the subject and you move on. But actually knowledge is constantly evolving, both in your heads and in the real world. And all these are different parts of a puzzle, whereas a book may be a static view where you sum up your view of what the world is like and where things have come at a particular point in time. A newsletter can be a continued debate with yourself week after week after week as you keep updating your knowledge. If one was to do podcasts, you could say that those conversations would be conversations with the world and always teasing and fleshing out the subject as well. So is that something that you've thought about? Because Pranay, I think you've been quite innovative in terms of how you assimilate knowledge and how you kind of do all of this. So what are your, and even within Takshashila, bunch of you do a bunch of different interesting things. So what are sort of your thoughts on this, that when we talk about a key skill in the new world which is coming is being able to, I think the fundamental key skill in the world that is coming is the ability to learn new things, because the world is changing so fast, and part of that has to do with assimilating knowledge and always constantly needing it around, and working with it. So what are your thoughts on this? Question to both of you, really.
Yeah, I think, like you said, I think book writing for me is too much of a high stakes thing. So you don't want to put a lot of weight in that. So, and like writing is a way to learn. And I've started saying that we should not have reading lists, but we should have writing lists, right? So that sort of helps. And because you're continuously writing every week in a newsletter, or it can be in any way, or you're doing a podcast on it, or you're writing op-eds on it, that process helps you tackle different things happening within the same domain, right? So even in semiconductors, the amount of things that have been happening since 2019 is just, breathless things happening. Every week there are 3, 4 announcements, and people jumping at it from many different directions. Sometimes people who have not had any exposure to that industry. So you might not have those knobs to see whether a news is actually worth focusing on or not, right? So everyone is jumping at it as something which is really important, and every single event is earth shattering, which it really isn't. But because of that, I thought writing continuously was really important. So just putting small posts out. We had a newsletter called Technopolitics. So that was the one I started in parallel to anticipating the unintended. So I started writing the semiconductor bits there and just putting things out. The good thing is in Substack, you can also create sections. So gradually we started using that newsletter to talk about many things in high technology geopolitics. But I could create a section on semiconductors and only focus on that. So that was one really helpful thing. And the other thing was teaching. So the good thing with Takshashila is I could do teaching and writing both, right? So, and teaching helped. So we converted this into a sort of a course. Again, that was a way for me to learn. And where else can I get people like Abhiram who are working in that industry to say that, this is bullshit, or I'm not explaining it well. So that helped. And talking to a large number of self-selected, interested people helped me sort of improve iteratively my teaching and the elements that went into it. So that writing and teaching combo, doing that over and over again and putting things out into the public domain creates a very nice feedback loop, which helped me develop this, right? So book was sort of not in my mind till 2020 when I started teaching. And after a couple of rounds of teaching, in fact, one webinar I had done for Ajay's research group. So another webinar for Ahmedabad University. And that's when someone else suggested to me that, hey, this is worth writing a book on. I said, okay, who will be interested? Like, okay, I'm talking about this, it's fine, but who will be interested? But they said, okay, I felt that there are people who are interested in it, given that it was appearing in the news a lot more. And that's when we thought, okay, maybe there's a book in here. You can convert this knowledge into a book. So that was our process. It was iterative, get small outputs as soon as possible out into the public, and then maybe a book just happened along the way.
Tangential question. I looked at some of the other books in semiconductors while I was doing this, some of which you mentioned, and looked at them in the sense didn't read them, just kind of glanced at them. And my impression was that actually your book is, if not the only book, at least the best book on the subject, tackling it overall, because the rest might be, too Western centric, or they're focused on one particular piece of the puzzle and all of that. And this seems to me to be like the definitive book. It's a great book. It's a world class book. Is it published only in India, or are you going to get international publishers, or do you feel that there is a sort of there is some kind of block there? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think right now it's published in India only, and of course the Kindle version is available everywhere. But yeah, depends on the sales, as our publishers say. But the idea here is, yeah, there have been a couple of other books on this topic. I think while we were just finished the first draft, the book Chip War came out. That was again a book written by an economic historian, Chris Miller. So that's also quite good. It focuses a lot on individuals and their stories who went into semiconductors, whereas we've focused more on the institutional angle and why nation states become good at innovation and some don't. Those kinds of questions motivated us. But yeah, so I think we will see a lot more on this field in the next coming years. given that with AI chips, etc., this area is going to heat up even more. But yeah, I think the book is relevant to anyone across the world. It's not specifically related to India only, but we came at it from an Indian interest, national interest perspective, and an Indian angle largely. So the questions for us in India are always, we have tried this. When we can be a space and nuclear power, why can't be a semiconductor superpower? What were the problems? And that was my angle. And also, I was like quite pissed off when we see, I attended many of these seminars where once the government announced this policy on semiconductors that we want to do something there. And a lot of those conferences, there were like a lot of people from outside and Indians asking white men about should India build a fab or not, or a semiconductor fabrication facility. Now, I am always open for ideas from outside. Of course, we should be open to, but this is a question that has to be decided by the government, society, markets in India, right? You can't ask, should ABC be done by India or not? You can ask, what can we learn from your experience or other countries' experience? So I was like, many of these books which are written have very little from an Indian angle. So we need to make that point. And India is a crucial note in this semiconductor supply chain. I mean, both of us are examples. Not that we have some great patents or anything, but we have been a part of this industry to understand that India does play a role in this. So we thought, there should be an Indian voice and an Indian perspective on this. Chip War, for example, mentioned the word India a grand total of 2 times the word and nothing about what India does. So it was also that, let's put this out from an Indian angle. And there's a lot of things happening in the Indian industry, in the Indian government on this sector. So we should put a view out. So that is how we came to this.
Yeah. I mean, just for the sake of the listeners, there are like 8 chapters in the book, and one of them focuses on India, and it's a sort of a great chapter. Before we get to the contents of the book, just a final sort of topical question almost, which is about, these rumors that came out after Sam Altman was no longer CEO for about 3 days or whatever that period of time was. There were these rumors that he had gone to the Middle East to raise money from funds for a chip fabrication company or a chip design company where AI would try to, design chips and, take on NVIDIA. I mean, that's how that was kind of being positioned, the way it was written about. And your book, of course, has a lot about the dominance of NVIDIA and so on. Not a lot, but you explain it quite concisely. So, just from a layman perspective, what is the take on that? Because it would seem to me that, one of the parts of your book, which we'll get to right after this, is about the great innovation that was happening at Bell Labs for a long, long time. And it seems to me that there is sort of a glorious summer of that same kind of innovation happening in certain parts of Silicon Valley and certainly in OpenAI. So how dramatic is that? Is it a big quantum thing, or is it just not a big deal at all?
Right. So just briefly on that Sam Altman, the rumor that we've heard of, but I think there are 2 different angles here. One is about AI chips and then making chips with AI. These are 2 different things.
I think the second angle is what they were hinting at, that he's going to make chips with AI, and because he's making them with AI, they'll be so good that they'll compete with NVIDIA.
Right.
That was a broad gist of what I could
So yeah,
get.
basically he's saying we'll make chips with AI, which will be the AI chips that can beat what NVIDIA does. So they're
Yeah.
both 2 different things. So I think NVIDIA, a lot of what OpenAI does for the pre-training phase and the training phase, they need specialized chips, which are called AI chips in common parlance. These are basically chips which are optimized to take lot of data and do parallel computations, right? So you can't do that with a general purpose Intel processor and all that. So NVIDIA actually made those for graphics. So there were the graphic processor units which were used for playing games, but it eventually got used in AI kind of workloads, and it was quite beneficial. So NVIDIA's stock really rose. So that is one angle, and I'm sure OpenAI, given that this is what costs a lot, right? One training run can cost you anywhere around $300K, etc. So given that it is a high cost, I'm sure OpenAI would be looking at how do you minimize that cost. And currently, I guess Microsoft is probably taking a lot of that expense, but they would want to reduce this, and probably in-house chip development could be one way out, because now they also know what are the exact kind of workloads that happen, how would a transformer algorithm actually work on this kind of chip. So maybe they have an insight which Nvidia doesn't, because they are working at a layer above Nvidia, and hence they might be wanting to do this. The second thing, using AI to make chips itself, whether it is an AI chip or any other chip, there's a lot of work happening on this, but it has not yet reached a stage where it can get the human out of the loop. But I know that DARPA, for example, has a plan to get the human out of the loop, like basically from architecture to getting a chip. They want to do that in a 24-hour workflow, so a lot of things are happening, but these are not at that level where they can do really, really complex chips. So it will be probably, it will start probably in a couple of years for really small basic chips, but we are not yet there where it can, replace humans. So that's where my understanding is, Abhira.
Because we were talking about designing chips using AI, that is kind of my thing, my point as well. Designing in general, it's not like just one company does it. It's, you mean, you design different blocks for a chip, and there are places where you get third party companies to actually design that block for you. And there are IP licensing companies like ARM, from where you can buy these particular blocks and you just place it in those chips. All these are, I mean, these are at least the cutting edge ones. These are all proprietary, and I mean, I don't think there is enough cutting edge information available open source for AI to actually train on and replicate it on its own. Like Pranay was saying, it might come up in a few years, but the open source information that is available on chip design, it is actually at least 10 years old, and it is only for the older legacy chips which are not as complicated. So it will be difficult for AI to actually design chips which are
Basically, they
cutting
don't
edge,
have the
right?
Wikipedia equivalent here easily
Hmm.
available, so it's going to
Yeah.
be tough.
I mean, a Wikipedia equivalent would be needed by generative AI, but if you're talking machine learning, I'm guessing then you don't need that. It's like AlphaGo teaching itself to play chess. So I then wonder, hypothetically, could you teach yourself to design chips without having a need for, previous human iterations being available to you?
Yeah, no, but even AlphaGo teaching itself to play chess, the previous stages of that would have been where AlphaGo actually learned by looking at various kinds of
No, no,
gameplays,
actually
right?
not. How it worked in the case of AlphaGo was that it was the rules of the game were wired in. That is the only thing that was programmed in. And then it played itself for 24 hours, and it played thousands of games against itself, tens of thousands. And during this time, even those tens of thousands of training games that it plays against itself are really fascinating, because it almost mirrors the evolution of human understanding of chess, where certain openings come into fashion, they go out of fashion. It starts playing the French defense, and at one point it stops. Then at one point, Vladimir Kramnik made the Berlin fashionable again at the start of the century in his match against Kasparov. It discovers a Berlin, and then it goes beyond that human evolution, and it starts doing things and humans enough to figure out why. So there was no LLM involved there. It was just the rules of the game, and it played itself. But obviously, chip designing is different because you're not playing a game. It's just a completely different thing. Let's kind of get to the narrative of your book, and before we start talking about semiconductors per se, I love the way that you set a backdrop for it in your book, and I want to talk about that backdrop a bit, because one of the things that you've underscored and that comes across starkly is how contingent everything is, how everything is almost dependent on certain circumstances working out one way or the other. You started your book with this excellent quote from you started one of the chapters, rather, not your book, with this excellent quote from Bill Gates about how if you put him in a time machine, he'll want to go back to 1947 in Bell Labs to see the magic that was happening there. And Bell Labs, which was a research arm of AT&T, was, as you've pointed out, and as all of us who've looked at tech know, was, so many innovations came out of there. It was a crucible of so much modern technology that we take for granted. But what particularly interested me was the fact that, number one, there was tons of innovation happening in America at the time, and two, that Bell Labs was the center of a lot of this innovation while other companies necessarily weren't. So, but tell me a little bit about that. Why was that the case? Why was that specific place buzzing with ideas and innovation and great minds? And, because in a sense, the semiconductor revolution really comes out of that ferment.
Yeah, when you look at Bell Labs, right, or when you look at US as a whole, I think during that point of time, it was a melting pot of all different cultures, and it was the first time a lot of people were actually coming together and getting educated in the same place, trying to understand from each other what was going on. So that we felt was an important aspect where people from different mindsets were actually working together on something with a united goal. And what was that goal? Was what was currently happening in the 60s and 70s. It was the kind of a Cold War era, and the prime goal for the US was of being one step better than Russia in technological superiority. So you have all these different brilliant minds working together in, let's say, one building or one place, hitting ideas of each other. And the one thing that was important in Bell Labs was that nothing was restricted. If you were working in Bell Labs, you could just directly go to any of the faculty there, or any of the senior researchers there, and ask to spend some time researching that. So, I mean, if you look at 1947, the time period that Bill Gates was talking about, that is when the building block of a chip, the transistor, was invented. And the transistor, if you look at it, it was three different people from three different backgrounds. It was just not physicists that were there. I mean, people had chemical background, and people had superconductivity, semiconductivity background, and solid state physics was required. So these were three different people with one goal of finding out a device which should make it easier to transmit over long distances. So communication was the focus, and at that point of time, AT&T was making long distance telephony, but you could go from New York to probably till Chicago. That is by when the signal would get so bad that it wasn't audible anymore. So they were trying to figure out a proper way to boost the signals. And what was before transistors, and what we have now are vacuum tubes and all. And they were just not that great to go long distance telephony. So they had one common goal in mind, and the additional, let's say, value that Bell Labs was providing was that it was kind of consolidated in a way that Bell Labs would provide AT&T, its parent company, would provide the telephones, would provide the overall distribution network, would provide the baseband antennas. And the government was also of the mind that if this whole network already exists, it doesn't make sense for another company to start from scratch on that. So Bell Labs had the monopoly. AT&T had the monopoly on communication. So, they did not have to worry about competition, and the funding that they had, they used to put it into projects of different varieties, from not only just on telephony, but trying to understand the overall landscape of how they can push electronics further more. That was the golden period where there was enough funding. They didn't have to worry about competition, and this was growing. But over time, it kind of went down, and the company became complacent, and innovation was going down. That we see a longer time frame. But at the beginning, this was, I would say, one of the important key factors: the lack of having to worry about constantly innovating at a short term mindset. They could go long term. They could actually fund 5 years, 10 years down the line. The transistor, I think, the project started probably 10 years before it was released. So this long term mindset could only come with that kind of foresight, and experiments which could be afforded to fail, which is what most companies do now. We see Google kind of adopting the same kind of mindset. But yeah, this was one of a kind thing that was happening then. So this is the overall landscape for the company that was going on. But if you look at US as a whole, initially, at least for electronics and semiconductors, as I said, the backdrop was of the Cold War era, and the military was the only client for all the semiconductor companies. And there were a few rules that these companies had to adhere to to make sure that they had contracts on the military. And two particular things that were highlighted were that the military had the right to distribute information produced under the contract. So even if Bell Labs was working with the military, they would provide quarterly reports which are available to every other company. So Texas Instruments could just take a look at what Bell Labs was doing and understand the cutting edge of what was going on, understand the science behind it, and probably could come up with something different. So in that way, there was some kind of competition that was going on, but even though Bell Labs had a monopoly, the competition started brewing at that stage. And also, there was this particular case where, at least 10 years down the line, there was this antitrust suit filed saying that Bell Labs had a complete monopoly and something had to be done about it. And one of the main things to come out of that was the patents that Bell Lab had, they had to be provided for free of cost. So within a fortnight, probably around 7,000 patents became free. And it was seen that the follow-on innovation that was seen by other companies using Bell Labs patents to come up with something new was around 17 to 20% higher than what Bell Labs was actually doing. So overall, I would say that Bell Labs had the funding to start out. They were kind of getting complacent, and with the antitrust suit and with military forcing a few clauses, competition was brought back up. They had the chance to put a foot into the industry, and they started innovating. And these were small startups. Some of them, were the forefathers of companies like Intel. So basically, it was this kind of storyline where eventually competition started picking up, and it was not enough for the military to sustain, and they had to go commercial and started selling to other electronics companies. So the growth, I would say, would be initial funding at the beginning, and then growing to other companies and going commercial.
So, I mean, before we get into this, I think we should also briefly discuss what is a semiconductor and a transistor, really briefly, I guess.
Let's come to that. I was actually laying the grounds for the environment in which it came up, and I'll come to the science and what is a semiconductor now. But
let me add to that itself, Amit.
Cool.
I think I totally agree what you said, that there were a lot of contingent factors in this. For example, monopoly, as we know from economics, actually would lead to stagnation, right? There's no incentive to do anything new. But there were a host of factors which happened at the same time, which led to also companies investing in research rather than just not doing a lot of long-term thinking. So one itself, you had this period after the World War where there were a lot of great minds coming to the US. So that was one contingent factor. And after that, it's not just Bell Labs, right? You also had organizations like RAND, etc., which came up in the 50s, 60s, etc. So that was one. The second factor was, like he said, there was this Cold War which started, right? And the Cold War was also a moment where, like, people who study the politics of innovation call this as creative insecurity. This is a term used by Mark Taylor, who studies this a lot. So creative insecurity is the feeling that the sum total of external economic and military threats are greater than the internal political and economic divisions. The more the creative insecurity, the more that nation states tend to invest in R&D and innovation. So this is again a counterintuitive thing for me, someone who doesn't hold governments in high regards on many of these things. But you can think of it from a very value neutral way, that finally R&D investment involves opportunity cost, and no nation state would want to do that unless and until there's some exogenous shock or requirement, right? I mean, a democracy would rather spend money on making the life standards of the individuals and the people who can't afford a lot of things better. That would be the default option. But when nation states started entering into this sort of the Cold War period, there was this creative insecurity which increased a lot. And there was this Sputnik moment. You literally, there were people in the US seeing the Sputnik satellite going around with their naked eye. You could see that sent a lot of, and of course other political, communism versus capitalism, that debate, that narrative was so strong that nation states, especially the US, started thinking that we have to do something very different. There was a whole restructuring of the research ecosystems as well. And of course, you had also the Vannevar Bush statement, etc., in the 1945. Then you had changes come in terms of because of the Cold War in the 50s. You also had these ideas of restructuring, starting of the ARPA, which became DARPA later on. And so all those, also NASA, etc., all those start from that ferment. So I think creative insecurity has something to do with making sure that the monopoly that some companies enjoyed didn't get translated into those companies just becoming static and not improving. And they in fact led to a lot of investment in trying to get it better, fund long-term projects, which was an interesting thing. I am still not been able to reconcile that, given my priors, that this should have actually led to stultifying rather than growing. But that has happened. And in fact, you'll see a lot in the semiconductor industry, government intervention has played a role, especially in the capital heavy parts of this segment, which again is tough for me to reconcile, but that's the way it is. So
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that fascinates me, as both of you would know, is unintended consequences of stuff. Like, I recently did an episode with Timur Quran where he was talking about, why the Middle East had stagnated for 1,000 years, since about 1000 AD till, the mid 19th century, when they started picking it up again. And the reason was that in circa 1018, and I won't go into details here, you can listen to my episode with Timur Quran, or there's an Everything is Everything episode on YouTube where I've discussed it with Ajay Shah as well. But essentially, they had incredibly progressive social laws and incredibly good, institutional innovations, particularly the Waqf, and and they were far ahead of Europe in that regard. But unintended consequences meant that economically they were stultified and they stayed back for centuries, which then kind of made them socially backward as well. And it's not something that you could have sat down a priori and figured out, from first principles. And similarly, the fact that, AT&T was a monopoly for so long, and you and I have been taught correctly that monopolies are a bad thing. They are bad for consumers, especially because consumers have to pay more, there is less innovation, etc., etc. But what it did was that AT&T got outsized profits because of this, and they managed to put that into Bell Labs, and their incentives there weren't short-term incentives that bring me something I can take to market next year, but they were like, not just research for the long term, but research in other fields which we have nothing to kind of do with. And the other thing where I think you and I are on the same page in terms of cognitive dissonance is the state spending. It is not the business of government to be in business, as we know, but state spending has often propelled so much innovation. You mentioned NASA, which came up with anti-corrosion coating and, all kinds of commonplace things like scratch-resistant coating we need now. DARPA came up with ARPANET, which turned into the internet, created an early version of GPS, a graphical user interface, a computer mouse traces its origins back. And as you point out, state spending during wars have led to the invention of radar, microwave, espionage, stealth technology, encryption and decryption algorithms. I read that sentence out from your book itself, which also doesn't compute. And obviously, there's a seen and the unseen factor here. There is a counterfactual of, if the state hadn't spent on this, what would it have spent on? And we don't know that. But the fact is, all these innovations did happen with their massive positive externalities. And all of these, in a sense, were unintended. Many of these were unintended. They just happened to come out of the research that you're sort of, doing in sort of that area. You have a beautiful part in your book where you talk about the Sputnik crisis, about how, after, 4th October 1957, NBC radio broadcast this beep and all of America went into panic because this was a Sputnik, and you could actually see it at times with the naked eye. And there was this sort of technological panic that, oh shit, the USSR is so far ahead of us and this is the peak of the Cold War. And therefore this spurs so much sort of spending. And I have sort of an anecdote from the other side, which is the Russian side, which is, one of the reasons why, unintended consequence, chess became such a hugely popular sport. That sometime in the 1930s, a gentleman named Nikolai Krylenko, who was, head of the Soviet Chess Association, and he was purged by Stalin in 1938, but for a while he was a pretty big guy. And at one point, he said that the USSR must sort of focus on chess because everything that they did was part of this battle to prove the ideological superiority of the Soviet Union over the US, and chess was one way in which they could get a leg up. And Krylenko's words were, quote, "We must finish once and for all with the neutrality of chess. We must condemn once and for all the formula chess for the sake of chess, like the formula art for us, art's sake. We must organize shock brigades of chess players and begin immediate realization of a 5-year plan for chess." Stop quote. And this is also, I guess, coming out of that sort of push towards innovation because you're panicking about others kind of going ahead. We'll come back to sort of geopolitics in this period later, but let's go back to that fundamental innovation of the transistor to begin with, and then how that goes ahead and what else happens. And you spoke disparagingly of vacuum tubes, but as you have pointed out in your book, 4 industries that dominate the world today, long distance telephony, radio, gramophones, and movies, came because of vacuum tubes. So do not mock them. They did their job before they were replaced. So tell me a little bit about what is a conductor, what is a semiconductor. Take me through a bit of the evolution of this beautiful thing that allows us to talk to each other right now.
Yeah. Before that, Amit, just one angle I wanted to add. That cognitive dissonance, the way I have sort of resolved is that actually 9 out of 10 times that strategy would fail, and we've seen that. In fact, we have many examples of how USSR tried to do that. It failed. India tried to do that. It failed because all of them thought we'll make a city where this will happen and we'll have a government run PSU which will make semiconductors, and it didn't work out. But there were some unique things which happened in the US ecosystem where they were thinking of AT&T not just as a government company. You were still thinking of getting people from different places, thinking long term and investing in R&D. I mean, in 1945 US was not as prosperous as it is today, and yet what were the reasons why they were thinking about that and not other things is a fascinating topic in itself, and a lot of people try to understand that. And there are many interesting examples, like Denmark versus Sweden. Both are GDP per capita wise great, but Denmark doesn't do so well in innovation, whereas Sweden and Nokia and Sweden and Norway and all do. So why is that? Those are all fascinating questions. I think a lot of work to be done, but one way we can understand is most of the times government run programs would fail, and that's how it is.
Yeah, and I'll double down on that and point out that when we talk about government programs that work, it's survivorship bias. Like you said, I think 95 to 99% of all programs failed. You have plenty of stuff in your book about the USSR, India, and China. Also failed in some areas where they tried to kind of push this. So state intervention, as we have seen through almost 80 years of Indian history, is generally almost extremely likely to fail. But there are these kind of spectacular examples of unintended consequences. So,
yes, state interventions also have multitudes.
Okay. Yeah, well said.
So, all right. So let's begin by just talking briefly about the semiconductors. And so largely semiconductor, as the word suggests, it's a material where the conductivity is between an insulator and a conductor, right? So the idea is a conductor electron flow in that is so high that you can't control it. It's perfectly useless if you want to control it. And in insulators, the flow of electrons will be so slow or not at all that again you can't control the flow of it. So idea is, if you can control the flow of electrons in one part of the circuit or the other, you can convert it into things like a switch, right? Or you can convert it into an amplifier and so on and so forth, that you can't do in a insulator or in a conductor. So semiconductors, largely silicon or germanium, if you see the periodic table, all those which fall under have 4 electrons in the outermost orbit. Those are things which are called as semiconductors. And the idea was a specific arrangement of this treated semiconductor can be made into a basic unit called the transistor, right? And on which then the word transistor comes for the radio, right? But the idea that it actually meant this arrangement of treated semiconductors which allowed this conductivity of electrons to happen in the most optimum way. We don't need to go into how it is made and all that, but the idea was that the superpower of the transistor was that you can control the flow of electrons in one part of the circuit by controlling the current in another part of the circuit. Now, it sounds very basic, but this is really a superpower, because you can convert this arrangement into a switch. You can convert it into a amplifier, because you can control the current flowing in another part by controlling some current in another part of the circuit, right? So these things really were a massive innovation, right? So, and you could do that at a fraction of the cost that you could do by using a vacuum tube, right? So as you were saying, vacuum tubes could do all these things, but to handle a basic addition process, you would require the amount of space of rooms, right, worth, and you would require electricity which would take a significant proportion of the electricity of a city at that time, right? Those were the kinds of things you would require to do basic things. But here you have something which is as small as it can be held in your hand. At that point of time, it was still quite big, and it could do all the things that you wanted to do at vacuum tubes, right? So you are basically transitioning from electrical to electronics through this period, right? So you are then dealing with really small currents, or dealing with really small signals, and yet you are able to achieve the functionality that you wanted, right? So this was really a magical thing, the transistor. And still it didn't solve the things, because even though you could have transistors, the connections between those transistors itself, after you have, let's say you have 100 transistors and you have to connect between them, the wires itself would become really problematic, and beyond a point, the complexity of that circuit would grow so large that you can connect things incorrectly and the failure rates would be high. So in the 1950s was when the next step jump happened, when something called the integrated circuit came into being. And those are the square black things you see if you open your phone or someone throws your phone, you will see those ICs are basically collections of transistors which are connected in many different ways to achieve specific functionalities. And that IC was the next step jump, because the connections between the transistors, etc., are inbuilt into it, and you can achieve various kinds of functionalities within a circuit, and that's why it's called an integrated circuit within a package. So now this was really a fascinating thing, and with that integrated circuit, the complexity of connecting transistors, etc., became simplified, and you could then the aim became that how many transistors can you pack in within this IC to achieve more and more complex circuits. And the fascinating part of this is that in 1965, Gordon Moore, after whom this Moore's law is named, which was just a vague prediction at that time, he just said that in Fairchild Semiconductors, where he was working, that the number of transistors they were seeing in that IC was doubling roughly about every 2 years. And doubling means you can achieve more functionality and you can do more complex things using that same thing. So this was what he said in 1965. And he also said that ICs will lead to such wonders as home computers, automatic controls for automobiles, and personal portable communications equipment. I guess the word mobile didn't strike him right that way back then. But he said this in 1965, and the entire technological and economic revolution of the industry has been such that it has become almost a law, in the sense that this has held true for 60-70 years, right? So one IC now per millimeter square, like in your Apple iPhone, will have 134 million transistors, whereas when he made this statement, and one IC had 64 transistors. So just imagine how wonderful and brilliant this has been and the progress has been.
Or it is like the guy who, there's this old fable about the king is happy with some guy and he says, "Tell me what you want. Whatever you want, I'll give it to you." And he says, "Give me a single grain on the first square of a chessboard and then double it with every other square." And then it goes to some kind of completely mad place. And as you point out, the current iPhone uses, has about 10,000 times, it's nodes which are 10,000 times smaller than the ones used in the 1970s. And I have a sort of I'll take a quick tangential leap as I tend to do on this podcast and ask another question, which is that one of the sort of something that comes along with Moore's law is not only the fact that not only the doubling, as it were, as it happens, and we'll talk about Rock's law later, but the not only the doubling of ICs every 2 years, but also the cost of things therefore coming down substantially because of that. And I think about that sometimes in the context of GDP. Like, I have done an episode on GDP ages ago with Rajeshwari Sengupta, but one common sort of complaint I have against the GDP is that there are many things that cannot measure, and one of those is this: that you can see that I bought a laptop in 2023 which might have cost 60,000, and I could have bought a laptop for 60,000 in 1999, but the productivity that I get out of my current laptop is orders of magnitude more than the one I would have got in 1999. That there are certain kinds of value that a GDP cannot capture because just monetary transactions cannot capture, and they also have a lot to do with the well-being of a society. So do you have any tangential thoughts on this question, being a policy person yourself, before
Yeah.
we move on?
But the GDP in this case, the laptop case, will include the additional consumption and the production that has happened because of the fact that it's this technological leap has improved the productivity of the person, right?
No, but some of
So
it could be joy to me. Some of it could just be joy to me. Like, if I was, for example, in the 1980s or early 90s, if I had to collect music, I would have to scramble so hard to somehow get a mixtape together. And most of the artists I want, I would not be able to get them in India, etc., etc. Today, we can listen to whatever we want, read whatever we want, watch whatever we want at the click of a mouse. And how do we put a value to that?
yeah, we can't, and GDP is not meant to do that. So
Yeah, yeah. No, no,
you're
yeah,
holding GDP to way too high standards than it should be, right?
Correct.
It is
I
a
can imagine
simplified thing.
GDP coming in front of me and saying, "Boss, what the fuck? ये तो मेरा काम ही नहीं है."
Yeah,
You know?
exactly.
And yeah.
कितनी चीज मांगोगे?
Kitni cheez mangoge? No, it's so weaponized and people take it so seriously. And I think that, hey, so much of human progress is actually incalculable through, crude methodologies like this. One of the sort of things that you write about in your book is you detail out not just a technological revolution, which you gave me a summary of just now, but also the sort of economic revolution that happened in semiconductors, which led to this incredible supply chain, which is so complicated, so miraculous, so mind-blowing. Like, you've got a lot about the iPhone processor chip and how that's an illustration of the kind of complexity and the kind of interwoven sort of connections that we have because of it. And I particularly love that because one of my favorite essays of all time is I Pencil by Leonard Reed, where he talks about how all the different components of a pencil come from so many places that it is impossible for any one person to actually make a pencil. There are so many countries involved, the supply chain is so incredible, and it's all the voluntary actions of people coming together that leads to this miraculous thing called the pencil. And this is an audio podcast, but we can see each other right now, so I will let my listeners know that I'm holding up what you could think is a pencil, but is actually a pen, but I'm getting the point across. So tell me a little bit about this miraculous supply chain, because at some level, this incredible supply chain is at the crux of our geopolitical problems today as well, right? So take me through, and it's up to you whether you want to use the iPhone processor chip example or not. I absolutely loved it because it is so detailed and so mind-blowing, all the stages of designing a chip, all the materials and everything. But, take me through how this supply chain evolved. What are the different components where at one point you might begin with one single party saying that, hey, main banaunga, I'll do everything and I'll make a semiconductor. And today that is such a ludicrous thought that there are so many disparate parts to the process and it is so complicated and so many links in the chain are so vulnerable that it becomes a huge, humanitarian risk and therefore a geopolitical issue. So, tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, so to get a basic understanding of the overall supply chain, we can take a look at the iPhone. But what I would say is I would call it like a relay race as such. One part from somewhere in the world gets done, and that gets moved to another country where the next part gets done, that gets moved to other, and so it's kind of a chain that goes throughout the world. And I think around multiple different countries have to be together, and it is the case that most of the times there is only one single country in the world that can do that part of the chain particularly. So I would classify the overall semiconductor supply chain into three different parts. First, starting off with what is called chip design. This is where you create the blueprint of the chip that you define what all it has to do. I mean, if you talk about an iPhone chip, it has a specific set of functions that it has to do. It has to take calls. It has to be able to browse the internet. It has to be able to receive signals. It has to be able to play sounds, and there are so many things that it does. So some team at Apple will sit and define what the next whatever A20, A30, whatever it is, and they'll start deciding on what all functionality that this chip has to perform. And there are a particular set of computer science languages which are used, like Verilog or VHDL, where you will particularly define what the chip has to do. That is all it does. This is just a blueprint that is given out. We think of creating one chip as building a city. Basically, there are multiple different blocks for a city, and there is probably something like a town square, and there is a sanitation department, there is a water department, and there are like roads connecting each of them. There are multiple cities that are there, and there are some ways to connect to other cities as well. All these kind of functionality has to be built into the chip, and the chip designers are the architects of that basically. So once this chip design is actually done, it goes on to chip manufacturing. This is where companies come in, and it might be the same company, or it might be a different third party company which only takes the blueprint and starts manufacturing the chip. Now that if the same company does it, it is called an integrated device manufacturer, IDM. Companies like Intel, they design their own chips and they manufacture their own chips, whereas companies that don't do it are called fabless semiconductors. They don't have a fab. A fab is what we call a manufacturing unit. So companies like Nvidia, Apple, they do not manufacture their own chips. So these are called fabless chips, fabless companies. And there are some companies which only do the manufacturing, which do not care about what kind of design it is. They'll just take the blueprint and they'll start making chips out of it. And companies like TSMC from Taiwan, they are the biggest players there. They take, I mean, all of Apple's iPhone chips are made by TSMC, literally all of them all over the world. So if you look at manufacturing, it also involves getting raw materials from around the world. You need sand. You can get it from multiple different places. I mean, US is one of a good place. Australia, you can get sand from, and you need to get all these chip making machines. Oh, those come from probably Japan or the Netherlands, and then you start making your own chip. I mean, you start making the chip using the blueprint provided by any of these companies, and what you get is a small square, probably it's the size of your nail, which contains the entire blueprint of the chip, and it is just silicon at that stage. It is not protected at all. That is when the third part of the supply chain happens, where this particular piece of silicon is taken to assembly and packaging. That is when layer when you open, like Pranay was talking about, when you open the phone, you have this plastic black color casing and all, right. That is when the assembly and packaging is where the silicon part of it is packaged, and it is made sure that all the connections are right to be, the chip has to communicate with your charger, so that connection should be open. All those kind of stuff is then defined there, and basically made sure that the chip will be sturdy in different kinds of temperatures. It doesn't get damaged very easily. So these are the three main parts of the supply chain, I would say: chip design, chip manufacturing, and assembly. And there are other peripheral parts where there is the research that happens. I mean, we were talking about how double the number of transistors are placed each and every time, every year or once in 2 years, right? The amount of research that is done is in the billions, and the semiconductor industry is only second to pharma in terms of the amount of part of its revenue that it spends on research R&D. 15%, roughly 15% of revenues of semiconductor firm companies go back to R&D. And other than that, there are specific research firms as well, which solely focus on one single part of the ecosystem. Let's say you want to make machines better. There is a whole, research institute that works on just making the manufacturing machines better and all that. So, yeah, this whole supply chain overall ties back together, and it's one part at a time. Chip design happens, then manufacturing, and then assembly. So this is the supply chain as such.
Yeah. Actually, I add a lot to this about why the economic angle and how does that come in, right? So that is what fascinated me also, Amit, like coming at it from a policy lens and an economic reasoning lens. A lot of people who write on this have focused on the technological advancement, but it is also a lot of, you can teach a lot of economics through the semiconductor supply chain, like how the invisible hand operates or how the comparative advantage based specialization operates and all that, right? And that is what you see in this industry as well. So as if we begin the story again from where there were every 2 years you were doubling the amount, the content in a chip, and hence you were able to do more. But this was not this was not coming at zero cost, right? You have to keep improving your manufacturing. You need to remember, when if you want to double the amount of transistors in the same area, that means each transistor has to reduce in size. Now in order to reduce in size, you will need to have machines which are able to make smaller and smaller transistors, right? And that is the capital intensive process which Abhiram was calling as the fabrication step, right? And that is, it gets really complicated beyond a time, right? So now for example, some transistors now which are made are just a few electrons thick, it's that small, that precise. How do you do that in few atoms thick, right? How do you do that really quickly and at high precision and fidelity? It's really tough. So once this started happening, where transistors kept getting smaller, you can't just use the same old machines to start manufacturing, let's say, a smaller transistor. You need to do huge amount of capital investment to see how the transistor at a smaller size can work equally well, because there will be some leakage effects and all that. So every stage when the transistor becomes smaller, you need to do newer in R&D, understand how the transistor works, etc. So it is not just an incremental change, it is a step change, and that's why the R&D requirements and capital investments are very, very high. Now, once for earlier, one company thought that I can do all this on my own. So in the beginning, it was that way. All companies were IDMs. Everyone did the design, manufacturing, and packaging on their own. But as this Moore's law sort of a prediction started becoming a law, and everyone started chasing this, the flip side of this was the Rock's law, which said that sort of the capital cost for manufacturing also doubles every 4 years. So this became very tough. So all the companies which were initially doing this, at some point of time they said, hey, every 2 years or I can't keep investing in making smaller and smaller transistors, and because the cost is going to double every 4 years. So this led to a comparative advantage based specialization, where some companies came up and said, why are you doing this investment? Let me be the contract manufacturer. So whether you're Nvidia or you are AMD, doesn't matter. I am just a contract manufacturer. You just give me your blueprint and I will mass produce it for you, right? So this was a massive productivity gain, right? So now companies which said, I want to start making chips, didn't have to bother at all about investing in this repeated capital investments every 4 years, which is doubling. They didn't have to do that. So they started focusing only on getting the architecture right. So that's why fabulous companies boomed a lot. So AMD came up, Nvidia came up, and all those fabulous revolutions sort of happened. So they got really good at making architectures, whereas there were some companies which only invested in contract manufacturing. So that's where Taiwan picks up. So TSMC is now a very well-known name. 3 years ago, apart from people in the semiconductor industry, no one discussed it. But now a lot of it is discussed because it was in the background. It was just a contract manufacturer which got really, really good at making the recipe that it makes it possible to manufacture these small transistors, which are 5-6 nanometer width, those at high fidelity, and that's what their expertise was. So this comparative advantage based specialization led to massive gains. You had capital investments being done by some companies. The design is a human capital intensive process. You just need large number of engineers, etc., and architecture design work. So that kept happening. There was also an environmental angle. So for example, at that point of time, this chip making process was really polluting, and people in the US didn't want that. So Taiwanese company said, we are okay to take this cost because we want to develop this industry, and we don't have the expertise that is required in architecture and design, but we have the expertise in manufacturing because they were doing electronics level assembly there. So we will take this cost and develop this. So that was one interesting angle again, right? So some nation states and some companies there decided that we will take this risk in another area and develop. Also remember, the costs in the US, labor costs in the US were very high. Labor costs in East Asia were low. So that was another advantage for packaging. It's a labor intensive process. So you need large amount of labor, which was available at cheaper costs there. So the price also worked as a beautiful signal. It led to different nation states and different companies focusing on the areas that they are good at, and eventually you had this supply chain, which is a fantastic innovation in most normal circumstances, right? So no one even bothered about where the chip comes until 3 years ago, right? Because the fact that it worked so perfectly, you didn't need to bother about where your chip came from. It just worked. Every chip, people have, the US Semiconductor Industry Association has done a lot of studies. Every chip makes almost 4 trips around the globe during this process because of the relay race kind of thing that Abhiram mentioned, right? Some companies are doing some part of it, etc. But it just worked absolutely fine, right? So in that sense, it has huge humanitarian benefits, But just the fact that now, because it is being seen, its nature of the supply chain also makes it useful to be used as a geopolitical instrument. Whether it should be used or not is a different question. I would say actually it is a net benefit to every human on this earth. So the goal should be resilience, and every nation state should work towards it. But that's not how geopolitics works. So because of this supply chain where some companies are doing one small part of it, the way it can be deployed geopolitically is that if you have control over that company, you can deny access to another country, and that's what has happened, and we'll talk about more about it later. But that is what the nature of the supply chain is, a fantastic human achievement, but it also makes it prone to be used as a geopolitical instrument, and that's what is been happening.
Yeah, and what I kind of loved about your book is how clearly it sort of lays out the diversity of inputs that just goes into a chip, and it's such a triumph of globalization. Like you point out how the silicon could come from China, the design and the software tools could come from the US, the primary manufacturing could be done in Taiwan, equipment from Netherlands, Japan, the US and Germany could go into it, Southeast Asian countries could assemble it, India or China could actually put the chip into the iPhone, and so on and so forth. And at one point you write, quote, a mere glance at Apple iPhone supplier list shows that it has more than 200 suppliers from over 43 countries across 6 continents. Breaking down each component into its basic form tells us that 60 to 70 elements from a pool of 80 usable elements in the periodic table are used in this entire process. And obviously, I think everyone would agree that this is a huge net positive. It's happening because of freedom of trade, and that if right at the start of the process, countries were to dig in and talk about nationalism, and we will support national champions, and we will, reduce our exposure to X country or Y country, such a miracle may not have happened. But as we have found in these geopolitical times, and especially during COVID, when the supply chains were kind of hit hard, and there was, so much pandemonium during the pandemic. Can we call it pandemoniac? Whatever. That this became an issue. And I want to ask you this broad question now. You mentioned resilience, and you pointed out that the reason we got into the mess we did after COVID was because we had ignored, or rather the semiconductor industry had ignored, and I think quite logically and rationally had ignored resilience over specialization and cost effectiveness, where they are all maximizing for their individual utility. The invisible hand is at play. They are making perfectly rational decisions. They're using comparative advantage. But an unintended consequence of it, because of the complexity of semiconductor chips, is that unlike in potato chips, you don't have resilience in the sense कि एक जगह supply बंद हो गया तो कहीं और शुरू हो जाएगा. That if any part of that extremely complicated chain breaks down, everything downstream is affected, and suddenly the world comes to a halt. Like the classic illustration of that is obviously, automobile manufacturers, particularly from Europe, getting completely screwed after COVID because they couldn't get the semiconductors they needed. And often a car would have, I think you point out, about 300 of them sometimes, and you simply couldn't deliver on that because all the demand was taken up by consumer electronics and the chips that they needed. So what do you feel about this larger question? How should we think about it? Resilience on the one hand, which is something that nation states would want, versus, specialization and, the kind of value that brings, which, is what would naturally arise because of the rational choices made by people.
Yeah, it's like at one level, basically you're applying at this thinking at multiple levels, and at one level, because of globalization, everyone's benefiting and it's a great positive. But it only works when every nation state agrees that globalization is in everyone's benefit, and this kind of semiconductor industry is sort of a common good which needs to be protected or at least held as a net positive. But when that assumption itself gets questioned, that is when you enter the current situation, right? So until this time it was okay, but now geopolitically there have been challenges, and US and China's relationship has worsened. And if you look at China's technology stack, it is only in a lot of areas it has caught up with US to some extent, but in semiconductors it is really behind, and it is largely dependent on many parts of the supply chain from other countries. So that's where sort of the US has chosen to attack it. Now, I'm sure in the US strategy cell, there would have been a thought that this will lead to loss and downstream consequences for their own consumers and their own companies, and yet they have chosen this as an option, right? So they have chosen geopolitics over the net gains that everyone has. So this is how it has operated. I would also say that there were sort of three things for due to which it became so important and so globally relevant. One is the geopolitics, which is US-China relations. Also because Taiwan is a central node of this industry, and you have this period where Taiwan-China relations are also worsening, right? So there is a lot of fear in the US and in many countries that what happens if for some reason China-Taiwan relations worsen, or if there is an invasion of Taiwan, right? What happens to the fact that there are many crucial factories in Taiwan? And that is one important element, because remember, for example, if for the advanced jets that US is flying, the chip is still probably getting manufactured in Taiwan finally, right? So what happens if China invades Taiwan for one reason or the other? So that is the second geopolitical reason why a lot of countries started thinking about it. The second one is the geo-economic imperative, which is illustrated by the example that you said during the pandemic. But there are also concentration risks in this supply chain, right? So what happens if one company just goes down for other reasons, for, let's say, investors don't have confidence in that company, or it is malfunctioned, right? So that leads to downstream consequences again. So or there can be even geographical risk, right? Just imagine there is drought in Taiwan, which has happened in the past, or if there is some earthquakes in Japan, and there are certain industries which are supplying very specialized materials, again there is a shock, right? So how do you sort of overcome that? So this is the second one. And the third one is the technological imperative itself, that you need semiconductors for any other advancement. Like you're talking about AI chips, or you're talking about 6G communications, you will depend on advancements in new architectures and new chips, right? So all three things have sort of combined, and there's this unique concoction at this moment, because of which it has become globally salient. And that's why I call it metacritical. It is not just critical. And that is what has led to the current moment. So I would say that actually just those companies diversifying into comparative advantage based specialization was really great. But we have this unique moment where all these three streams have combined, and that made this sort of go in directions where no one had anticipated. And now nation states are saying that, okay, now we need to think of resilience. We can't just think about comparative advantage based specialization. We need other ways. Now that doesn't mean just making everything back home. It might just mean that maybe you need to have a set of partner countries in which you do comparative advantage based specialization, instead of earlier where it was whether you're an adversary or not didn't matter, as long as all the consumers across the world are benefiting from it. But because this industry will also lead to significant changes in other technologies, and other technology is perceived to be a bigger part of national power going ahead by many nation states, whether we agree it or not, that is driving this fear that you need to be careful where this industry is. Even though it might not be in my home turf, it should be in a friendly nation state. So that's the change.
So, after the break, we'll dig into what your book does so well, the descriptive nature of geopolitics. But before we get into that, I want to ask you a normative question quickly before the break. Like throughout your book, you've spoken about points of view that are essentially countries' points of view. And, and as you know, I think that there is a danger always in thinking like that. A country, of course, will think like that, but individuals and, when we think of societies and economies, sometimes that can be a little bit of a trap. For example, and this is something I discussed in an episode of Everything is Everything recently with Ajay Shah, we linked that from the show notes, that when people talk of something like a trade deficit, as if it's a bad thing. Now, a fiscal deficit is a bad thing. A trade deficit, there's nothing bad in it, because countries don't trade with countries. Individuals and individual firms trade with each other, and every trade is to mutual benefit, and people are always better off. And it doesn't, matter where the balance is. For example, I have a trade deficit with my domestic help. I keep paying her and she doesn't ever pass any money on to me, and that's perfectly fine. It's a positive sum game. We are both mutually benefiting. And and when I think about like one theme across your book is how different countries at different times have used tools like tariffs. Now, one can understand why a country goes in for a tariff, but a tariff is always essentially, in my view, a redistribution of wealth from the poor to the rich. Consumers suffer; they get a worse price or worse, they get a higher price or worse quality, and certain interest groups of local manufacturers kind of benefit. Now, there are other unintended consequences which might be good, which might be bad, whatever. And I understand that in your book, you're not recommending that people think about it from the country point of view. But how does one kind of reconcile this? Because at one level, if I put on the hat of, oh, I am an Indian, then I will read certain things and say, yes, India should do this. Of course, we should have tariffs. But on the other hand, if I just think as a human being and don't think about these boundaries, my entire thinking kind of changes completely. So and I'm sure this is something that you have grappled with as well, because on the one hand, you are deeply interested in economics, where you get that individual point of view I'm talking about. At the same time, you're interested in geopolitics and foreign policy, which is countries looking at the world from the country's point of view. And a nation state could easily argue that, look, it's prisoner's dilemma. As long as other nation states are thinking of their own interest, I have to do the same. If all of us were suddenly saying good of humanity, let people trade, let people flourish, then it wouldn't matter. But that is never the case. So this is again another area of cognitive dissonance with me, where your book has so many examples of it. For example, Ronald Reagan, who is supposed to be a president who is so good for freedom and all that. But every time you mention him in the book, it's in the context of him doing something that is actually against individual freedom and for the national interest. Ki tariff lagao, 100% tariff lagao on DRAM chips or whatever from Japan because they're catching us, etc., etc. I don't remember the specific examples. The book is full of them. So how do you reconcile this particular cognitive dissonance?
Yeah, it's tough to reconcile. But the way I see it is, when I'm talking about domestic relations, liberalism and liberal values are really the guiding light, right? And all the things that you said, Matt. But when you're talking about the nature of the international system, there a lot of realism applies, So a lot of things are, fortunately or unfortunately, nation states are contesting against other nation states, and there is a fundamental dissonance there, but that's the way that system is, so it doesn't matter whether what I want or not, but the idea is that, just imagine, right? So US and China, for example, now based on our principles, US sort of is the more closer one to our values, interests, and all that, right? So you would want US to confront China, right, in one way or the other. But that also means if you do anything to China, it will lead to some downstream consequences for Indian consumers, because China is so globally integrated in every manufacturing element that if there's a decline in the economic growth there will be consequences and negative consequences to us. So which one do you choose? Which is the option to choose here? It is a tough thing to reconcile. But for me, it's always that when you're talking about international relations, you look at interest, and there is something called a national interest, and that national interest could very well say that well-being of all my citizens is the national interest. National interest doesn't need to be territorial integrity and all that, but as long as you're thinking in terms of my national interest is well-being of my citizens, and then start from that point, you can merge realism and liberalism you can sort of draw a bridge between them in the domestic versus international realm. But yeah, that's dissonance always exists, and there are hard trade-offs that you have to make at some points.
Multitudes, no man is an island. Let's take a quick break. On the other side of the break, we'll dig a lot more into the fascinating geopolitics and how we are all going to hell. So after a quick break. There was a time when Pune used to be called the Oxford of the East. It was a hub of social movements, of educational institutions, of intellectual ferment. But since the seat of government is in Delhi, all the policy making happens there. Well, Pune is back. This episode is sponsored by the Pune Public Policy Festival. The Pune Public Policy Festival is an important step towards re-establishing the city at the center of intellectual discourse. On the 19th and 20th of January 2024, Pune's brightest experts of business and policy will interact with some of the most eminent economists and thinkers of the country. This particular event is about the trade-offs that India will face in the next decade. Trade-offs between growth and equality, development and environment, convenience in technology and privacy. Professionals and bureaucrats, academics and students, insiders and outside experts will gather together to discuss the shaping of the world. For more details and to register, head on over to www.pppf.in. This will also be linked from the show notes. The Pune Public Policy Festival 2024, a historic city building towards a brave new world. Welcome back to the Scene and the Unseen. I'm chatting with Pranay Kotasane and Abhiram Manchi about their excellent book about the chips being down. But, while we were away for the break, Pranay thought, and he couldn't, he was turning and twisting because there was something he had forgotten to say it in an answer to a previous question. But there is always a second chance, and that chance has come. You wanted to make a point about the trade deficits, and I had made the point that it's not a problem from the individual point of view, but you have something to add to that as well.
Yeah, so the cognitive dissonance that we were talking about, I don't face that in the case of trade deficit specifically. And the reason why I was saying is actually trade deficit can be justified on national interest grounds as well, not just from an individual grounds. Because even if you think the unit as a nation state, now if you're running a trade deficit with respect to China or say any other country, what it means is that you are buying a lot more from China, and which means there are companies in China and individuals in China who are dependent on you and your market, right? So in that sense, you actually have a leverage, and that is what China has used to get better technologies, etc. as well. They call it the TMFT, Trade Markets for Technology Strategy, right? So trade deficit often is actually a strength. So if you saw between China and Australia, for example, Australia used to export lots of things to China, and China was such an overwhelming buyer of things that it could utilize it a geopolitical instrument to say to Australia that, hey, we are not going to buy your wine and lobsters, and that actually made things difficult for Australia and not for China. So trade deficit is actually it's fine even from a national interest point of view, and that's why I see views that ban Chinese companies setting up in India is actually really a stupid move, because if those companies are set up here, the risk is theirs, not ours. And this is something that Swaminathan Iyer had also written in a very nice article many months ago. But the risk is theirs. If their products are being sold here, we have the leverage, not them. But when you think from a very short term perspective, many people start thinking any trade deficit with another country is actually a problem. It really is not. You can think of it as leverage.
And I particularly, feel the pain in the case of banning TikTok. Like in the same month where it was banned, I had launched this course. I only taught one cohort of it called TikTok in Indian Society. And people talk about WhatsApp University. The course was actually conducted on WhatsApp because I had to send hundreds of vertical videos to illustrate different points I was making. And the easiest way to do that was on WhatsApp. You can't really do that on Zoom, but WhatsApp, you just get everything in the group and then you scroll at leisure. And I thought it was a huge net benefit to Indians, especially Indians in small towns and villages. That combination of ubiquitous geo broadband and TikTok was simply mind-blowing. And somehow I think even today, Instagram Reels and YouTube Shorts haven't quite taken that space or allowed for that same kind of expression.
Yeah. And I think of it even again from a national interest point of view, just think TikTok is global. Lots of people in the world are using it. So even if the Indian state didn't have to think about individuals, let's say they were thinking only geopolitics wise, you have lost your side of the story from the entire platform, right? Globally, right? So for example, a person in the US, when they are thinking about, let's say something happens between India and Pakistan, and TikTok is the primary mode of consumption for a lot of people across the world, which side of the story are they going to see right now, right? Like they are going to only see the Pakistan story now, right? Unless they have also banned it, I don't know. But you're not going to see the Indian side of the story. So there is an individual loss, of course, like that one individual sitting in some village in Maharashtra could have been reaching across the world, not just in India. So that is definitely a loss. And there is a loss from a national interest perspective as well. So it doesn't make sense to me. There are views made that, okay, it had some algorithms which things were being used by China in other ways, but there are other ways to get around that. You don't need to ban it. So that's a total loss.
Wise words, May. Wise words like yours percolate everywhere, and I should invite you on the Scene and the Unseen sometime. Oh, but wait. Okay, so let's continue down our geopolitical route, and to understand the current geopolitical crisis, I think we need to do what you've sort of done in your book so well, that go into the history of each country and its own relationship with technology and semiconductors, and the role that it has played there, and so on and so forth. And I guess the US would be a good place to start because it all started there. And as you pointed out, the US actually have been part of two sort of geopolitical battles in which tech played a major part in the past, one during the Cold War and one again in the 1980s. So and this is really like the third time. So give me a sort of a potted history of America's relationship with semiconductors and the role that it has played in its politics and geopolitics.
Yeah, so we kind of alluded to the Cold War part of it where we were talking about the Sputnik crisis. So basically, for the race for technological superiority, when Russia was the first, or USSR was the first to launch a satellite, there was a collective gasp overall in the US, and the immediate next step that government took at that time was, start looking at its own programs, its own space programs, and then there was a funding increase of over 100 million in education and R&D. And also at the same time, they would also start funding NASA and DARPA and all, which, as we already discussed, had a lot of higher magnitude effects overall for the society as a whole. Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that they had the plan to to make the society better in general, and they started doing all this. They had their own motives to start working on technological superiority, and it ended up eventually helping out everyone as such. So this kind of the creative insecurity that Pranay was talking about, this plays, at least we feel this plays a major role in making sure that the overall society benefits from whatever technological advancements are there that are happening right now. And other than that, I think what the US has gone on to do eventually that we need to focus on is, once it was able to get a technological superiority in semiconductors, which is what its focus was on, and the initial Apollo missions also ended up using semiconductors instead of vacuum tubes as such, and and they were minuscule. They are nothing compared to what we have now, but they were a huge step up when you look at it at that time. The Apollo mission and the first moon landing had proper chips being used, and that is one of the major reasons for USA's one up over Russia. And eventually, Russia tried to replicate it. Russia tried creating a whole city, Zelenograd, it was called. It's a semiconductor city, and but they had their incentives slightly misaligned, where the focus was not on innovation, but the focus was on trying to imitate what US had done. So the scientists at USSR would be given chips from SS Instruments or Fairchild or something, and they would be asked to replicate what this was doing. So the culture of innovation as such was not propagated, and that would be one of the failing points in USSR. And the funding that was also given was also uneven, where different governments would place different priority on how much money should be given to semiconductors. And given that it was only funded by the government, and there was no marketplace as such where companies could invest on its own, that was also a big blow for the growth of the industry in Russia, which is where at least we feel healthy competition and moving to commercial in the US actually helped out a lot in that uh, part of time. The second kind of technological fight that we were discussing would be the US and the Japan. We call it colloquially the calculator wars. Where, I mean, for the Cold War, we all know it was an ideological conflict. They had to make sure either capitalism and communism, which was on top, and that was there. But for this, basically, US and Japan were allied to a large extent, and US had actually, helped Japan set up its own economy, and it helped fund the initial growth of electronics in Japan. They provided free access to knowledge transfer. Cutting edge technology could be to make sure it could be replicated in Japan easily. They provided initial seed funding, and there was a lot of joint ventures that were happening at that time. And Japan was able to quickly pick up and catch up to where US was at that point of time in memory chips. So if you look at chips in general, there are two main differentiations. One is called logic chips and one is called memory chips. Logic chips do all your operations, your addition, subtraction, and whatever your laptop is able to do. And memory chips store the memory. So memory chips were all the rage back in the 70s and 80s because they were easy to manufacture. They were not technically not too difficult to design also. So Japan first got into making memory chips as such, and because Japan was pretty good at manufacturing, they were able to optimize hard. And the overall manufacturing capability of Japan and the yield of chips that Japan was able to produce was over the next 4 or 5 years was significantly much higher than what US was able to do. And in that sense, Japan was able to sell chips for cheaper in the US than the US firms could. And we were all talking about the trade deficit that was there, and this is when there was a trade deficit between US and Japan, and that is where US kind of freaked out, and they were thinking of what ways we can, manage this trade deficit. And one of the first things that the Ronald Reagan government did was put price floors and put set up tariffs as such. I mean, it was more focused on appeasing the semiconductor giants that were lobbying hard to Ronald Reagan, because you had companies like Intel and Micron and Texas Instruments which were fighting hard, saying we are doing the best we can, but Japan is just dumping their chips onto our land for prices that we cannot even think of dropping our chips to. And the other fact was that it was very difficult for American companies to actually get a foothold in the Japanese market. I mean, logically, it makes sense because Japan chips were much higher quality and cheaper. The penetration that Japan had, consequently, the penetration that America had was much lesser than that. So this was another factor to say that Japan, was doing some kind of shady practices probably to get that. And the first thing was tariffs were set up. And the second thing was that the US mandated a 20% market share for American companies in Japan. So the effects that these had on both the countries were that the prices of the Japanese chips also went up, and the American chips were also no priced at an equal rate, but the consumer lost out overall in the US. And in Japan as well, the US chips were getting sold, but those were not of the same quality, and those are much more expensively priced. So the consumer there was also losing out. I would say, and the follow-on effect of that was because Japan was losing out on such a huge customer because they were pricing high. At the same time, South Korea would come in and start pricing chips lower, and it was able to get a dominant market share in the memory chips segment. Eventually, both US and Japan lost out in memory chips because they were not able to compete with the prices that South Korea was doing. And the overall the effect that we see was that there were some technical issues that were happening both sides, and one of the advantage that we got from that was South Korea coming in, and the economy of South Korea developing, piggybacking on semiconductors. Samsung, it was just doing normal electronics by then. It moved to semiconductors, and the other effects that we could also see were US starting out with consortium of sorts. All the major US players, all major semiconductor players in the US at that time, you have Intel, Texas Instruments, National Instruments, and Fairchild, everyone. They got into a consortium and they were able to get funding from the government. There was an industrial policy where the government would provide $100 million every year for 5 years to combat Japan's significant rise and significant market share in the memory market. The result of this was kind of mixed, I would say. I mean, there were some innovations that took place, but overall, it seemed like it was money given to these companies to make sure they could price their chips cheaper for a longer term. So that was one of the unintended consequences that you could see at that time. The policy did not work as it was intended to, and at the same time, the other side of that would be because Japanese companies were doing so well. There were plans of actually acquiring Intel, and this is when IBM got scared about what would happen if its major supplier was in Japanese hands, and they took a minority stake in Intel to help them supply logic chips. So logic chips are much more complicated in nature and take significant amount of R&D, and it's not as simple as manufacturing memory chips. So Intel's focus on logic chips helped them make the first chip for a general computer, and that grew and grew, and you had your mobile telephony and you had your mobiles coming from that. So slight technological fight was not ideological fight, but it was more of gaining market share and putting your nation's importance first. And the unintended consequences were the fall of memory chips in both Japan and US. But you saw that logic chips came about, and you saw that South Korea came about. So there are points to make on both sides. But we feel there was an overall technological improvement that we could see in the US because of this conflict that arose.
If I could add, Amit, there's a common, like a macro picture if we take here. Many things start in the US, and then there is some technology transfer to other countries, and that is also held by the post World War world order, where there is trade is sort of seen as a positive, and also US has all these allies in East Asia. So these countries like Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, they get technology transfer very easily. US companies are easily investing. There are no export controls as such for these countries. So these countries, companies in these countries have some collaboration with the US company, learn things, and then they steadily improve their capabilities and eventually catch up in some area, and that sort of threatens US back home. So all this industrial policy thing that you're seeing now is not the first time, right? In Japan's case, as Abhiram said, we had the same wave where US US government invested a lot for their local semiconductor industry. But as again we see, the advantage with the US was all that industrial policy didn't succeed in the way they wanted to, but in fact it eventually led companies like Intel to focus on semiconductors and focus on developing logic chips, and that led to what it is today. So really not that what the government policy intended, which wanted to substitute Japan's dominance in memory chips. That didn't happen, but Intel did get better in some other things. So it has been amazing to see how US has constantly been able to re-innovate itself. Maybe their ecosystem is such that they have been able to get things on track despite or in spite of government actions.
And at the start of the episode, we were talking about how contingent everything is, and I loved this little bit where you speak about post-war Japan. Like, of course, you lay out the history of the 100 years before World War II and the Meiji Restoration, and how Japan is a rising power, and then suddenly the war destroys them, and America come in with all these sort of terms. And at this point, you write about their housing crisis. You point out that they had a huge housing deficit in 1945. They had a shortfall of 4.2 million units. They lacked 3 million in 1955. So the Japanese government tried to make mass public housing available. These affordable public houses were built outside the city, and the middle class loved them. Except that, nuclear families shifted to these locations away from city life. And, Japanese women, when the men went to work, Japanese women didn't have anything to do. There's no social life. There's no, all the things that a city has. And they need televisions. And this leads to a boom in television manufacturing, especially because 1964 Tokyo Olympics is coming and everyone wants to watch that. So there's a television boom. And then at one point they realize that, hey, this television boom is going to end. What do we do then? And then they invest in personal calculator research, and all of this is one strand playing out. Another strand you point out is that there's an ideological war, in a sense, where the US realizes that communism must be fought, and therefore to fight communism in Asia, which is really North Korea and China, they come up with what you've described as a containment policy, which is they decide that, okay, Japan, South Korea and Taiwan must be our allies, and we will support them in whatever way, including making their future semiconductor industries decades from now, much more stronger than they would otherwise have been. And then that becomes a factor in this transfers of technology and know-how and all of that happening. And then you talk about this government project in Japan between 76 and 80 called the VLSI project, which also moves towards an innovative economy from what you earlier called an imitating economy, and then they are churning out patents, they are dominating lithography manufacturing soon, and so on and so forth. And, eventually then East Asia takes over DRAM memory chips, and I think they had some 85% by 1995 of the world market in that. And it's kind of pretty insane, and you've just pointed out how the US reacts to that. Now, give me a deeper sense of what's actually happening in East Asia. Like, I just shared these broad contours because I'm just so enthusiastic about this story. There's so much happening here. And at another level, it is a simpler tale of you start down the value chain. Maybe you're doing assembly to start with, and then you start moving up, and then you get into manufacturing and design and so on and so forth. So is it simply a case of moving up the value chain as you grow richer, or these contingent factors all really sort of play a part? So give me a sense of East Asia now, and of course Singapore, Malaysia are also part of that. But Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan are the really fascinating stories.
Yeah, before Abhiram talks about the technical bits, again, there is a larger economic story here. I don't think there is like something spectacularly different about semiconductor progress in East Asia, and they just got better at many things like automobile industry and all also. So the story is similar. That first, a lot of people talk about, for example, that Taiwan, South Korea has these chaebols and they are all national champions, etc. But a lot of people forget that the story starts with lowering of import tariffs. There was a lot of trade which happened in the 50s. This is before the military government came in. That led to a situation where they saw the benefits of integrating with the global market. There was also a devaluation of the currency which happened in South Korea. It happened in India also in 1966, but India stepped back, whereas South Korea kept on that track. So that led to South Korea actually becoming very integral part of global value chains when this word was just coming up, right, where this comparative advantage based specialization was just beginning to happen. They were at the right moment there. So a lot of American companies setting up some contract manufacturing shops there, all those happened, and then they become better over time, just like with any other country, right? There's no magic bullet in that. They keep developing capabilities and get better at it. So was the case with Japan as well. Specific pathways are different. For example, Japan was a lot more focused on having national companies, whereas South Korea was more open to MNCs establishing some bases here. So those minor differences were there, but overall story was similar. Start at just electronics assembly, just do original equipment manufacturer, white labeled product for some American company. You learn that, then you go to the next stage where you think, okay, now I can probably do chip assembly, not even manufacturing. Then chip assembly, after that you get better at, okay, now can I, there's a sinking ladder theory in software also. It's quite similar. So then you start capturing what is the next bigger value that I can occupy in this revenue chain. So then you start thinking of doing fabrication and so on and so forth. So that's what happened in South Korea, Taiwan and Japan. All three cases there were some elements. The difference was in China's case. So for example, because as I said, the tech transfers were easily available in these countries because there were political convergence between US and these countries. But with China, that was not the case, right? So China didn't get the technology transfer that these countries got. So China tried to do its own version of Atmanirbhar. Actually, Atmanirbhar is a strategy used by Mao Zedong as well. It was called
I
Zerli
literally,
Junction.
one of the headings in my room research is China regeneration through Atmanirbhar. So that
Yeah.
thought struck me as well. You haven't used it in your book, of course, but it struck me.
Yeah, yeah. So they started doing that, and so their strategy was, okay, we'll do things through the government route. So government industry will start that will make chips, etc. They started doing this way back in 1956. So they also had this government plan that semiconductors are important. We'll do something there, and as it happens in many government-run programs, there was some initial start. They were able to cobble together something, but after a few years they were not able to keep pace with these advancements, the high capital costs required, and they sort of fell behind Taiwan, Japan, etc., which took the lead. And later on, it was only through FDI of American and other companies post liberalization, in 90s, that China got technology transfers, not because of good political relations with the US, but largely because it opened FDI, and there were a lot of US companies which set up shop there, and that's how Chinese companies learned and then again got better. So that was sort of a difference in the pathways that Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea had versus China. Abhiram, you have anything to add?
Yeah. So one more important thing which took place at the same time was the environment overall in all these countries was getting substantially better. The infrastructure was getting better, and people were actually focusing on making the overall livable environment much comparable to how it was in the US. So the return of people who are from Taiwan, from South Korea, from China who had gone to the US, that played a very important role. So you were talking about Maurice Chang. He also worked in Texas Instruments in the US, but he came back to set up TSMC. So coming back of people from US to these countries, where right now the salaries were also comparable and the environment was also conducive, that they could do their own research, and there was no hindrances to that. That played a major role to make sure the quality of the product that was produced was actually on par with being export led. That was very important as well.
And another sort of a broader question. Earlier you spoke about Zelenograd, and we'll come to Europe, but you spoke about Zelenograd set up by the Soviets to be like their Silicon Valley, and that completely failed. You've laid out all the reasons for why it failed also. And there was, by the way, they had a separate division called Directorate T. I completely fucking love these names. Directorate T. And their mission was to acquire Western equipment and technology. But as you point out, they weren't really doing original work. The emphasis was on copying, not on R&D. In the rest of the world, there were substantial markets for chips, but for Soviets, it was only the military. The supply was uncertain because a lot of the equipment and raw materials were smuggled. It was all a mess, and it's easy to kind of see why it failed. And it's a sign of what the state was like. Like, you and I both champion nuclear power, and how incredibly safe it is. And people will always say, but Chernobyl. And actually, Chernobyl was a failure of the state, of a really ossified state. Also at a time when the technology was much older. Nuclear power is totally the safest form of power known to man by an order of magnitude. And we've discussed this in a past episode, I think, as well. I remember talking about this with you and Nitin. But leaving that aside, and and that's just the Soviet state. That's why they failed. And you see the failure happening with China as well. Like, at one point you cite the book Paper Tigers, Hidden Dragons, and you talk about how, Douglas Fuller, the author of that book, classifies firms into 4 categories. Number 1, neglected domestic firms with little funding from the state. 2, favored domestic firms considered national champions. 3, foreign MNCs. And 4, hybrid firms with Chinese DNA but access to foreign funding, or FDI as it would be. And the state's intention was that the second category, the national champions, would flourish. But actually, the state's intention didn't lead to outcome, as it rarely does. It was actually, because they opened up FDI and created that sort of enabling mechanism, those were the companies, the 4th category, which really flourished and sort of did well. So my, again, meta question to you is that we see different kinds of state intervention through this story, right? We see the Americans getting a lot of stuff right. and we see the Soviets getting it completely wrong, and China broadly getting it wrong and getting some things right by accident without really knowing what happened, or without intending to get it right in that particular way. What is there a lesson in this about state interventions as well? That there are ways in which interventions will always fail, and there are ways in which you are a little more likely to succeed. For example, I would imagine if you focus on creating an enabling environment rather than directing companies what to do, you're more likely to succeed. As China did by setting up the special zone at Shenzhen, for example, or Taiwan, of course, famously set up a special zone like that much before that, and South Korea copied them. And those enabling environments to me would seem to be one reason. But as you've studied this way more than me, what can states learn from this? कि ऐसा intervention काम करेगा, ऐसा नहीं करेगा?
Yeah, I think the one macro lesson for me was government should never run semiconductor companies. Wherever they have tried to do that, it has failed. In the US case, it was never government running these, especially not in design. Maybe the funding for some fabrication, etc., was subsidized, but not beyond that. So that is one. And to the wonderful list that you added, USSR, China, we should add India there as well, which was no different. The same strategy we followed. There were two Indian companies, government run companies, which again got some head start, were doing something. But what happens, right, in these industries, the only way you can survive is to first serve the consumer market, not just the military and the government market, right? Because the amount of money you need to claw back into the next stage of development can only come when you are doing mass manufacturing for a large market, which cannot be military. Militaries will require some few thousand chips a year. You can't sustain on that demand alone. So you need to get really good at one, manufacturing for consumer scale products, and second, when you're doing for consumer scale, you have to be good internationally, not just for your old products that your citizens might want. So wherever countries have gotten better at that and companies have gotten better at that, they have succeeded. Whereas when you are a government run entity, none of these incentives apply, right? So for me, there were like three lessons actually. One, that government run companies have no incentive to compete in a hyper competitive space, which requires constant capital infusion and technology upgradation. So they start first and they can't keep themselves in the race for long. So even eventually when they start getting things right, by that time the products are so costly that government companies itself will not buy from them. They will import from elsewhere. So that is one thing you will see in all these stories. Second, actually, because they are government companies, the incentives run very differently and they are shielded from internal competition. So this I can illustrate with the Indian case, where you had two companies, both were manufacturing chips, again from some technology transfer from the US, etc. So they got started. But when the money is being given by government, competition is actually a waste of that resources, right? So because why the government thinking was, why should I put money in two companies? What the hell? Like, why can't I get them to focus only on one thing? And that's what happened. So in fact, Bharat Electronics Limited and Semiconductor Complex Limited were both trying to do this, but the government said, SCL, you only do chip manufacturing. BEL, you only do some overall component manufacturing, not chips. And eventually there was sort of no competition for them to get any better. That was not what happened in Taiwan, for example. So Taiwan, first the government-led ERSO was able to spin off multiple private companies, and there was competition between them. So you had TSMC, UMC, PSMC. There were multiple players who were competing with each other. Whereas in government, that because government was giving the money, every money was seen as having huge opportunity cost. So they eventually had no incentive to make these companies compete. So that was one. This is fundamentally at odds with innovation, right? How will you improve? And third, there was also Russia, USSR, China, India at that point of time were all looking from trade from a very negative perspective. So they were all having inward looking trade and business policies. That again proved costly, So the dominant narrative there was we have to save foreign exchange. And how do you save foreign exchange? Stop imports. So you had all these companies which wanted to do things, but they themselves couldn't import equipment, etc., to really start churning cutting edge products. So their requests were pending in some government ministry of trade for long periods of time, and eventually they just fell behind. So this is one lesson you can draw out from all government run efforts in this industry.
Let's talk about Europe now. You've taken us through sort of America's journey through this, including their two sort of wars with, first, tech wars in a sense, where it becomes part of their foreign policy. First with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and then with Japan in the 1980s when Japan starts getting ahead in DRAMs and so on. We've spoken about East Asia a bit. Take me a bit through Europe, because you would imagine that Europe is extremely well placed, to do really well. We've spoken about what went wrong in Russia, but otherwise you would imagine that as far as Western Europe is concerned, they should do pretty well. US allies like the UK, Netherlands, France, West Germany, before the reunification, were a part of the global semiconductor ecosystem. But yet, at one level, first they started kind of falling back, and then there were these different initiatives which worked out in very interesting different ways. So, to get us up to the current time, just take me through a little bit of the history of how this played out there, both in a technological sense, a geopolitical sense, and, just how those industries evolved.
So when you look at Europe, one difference was that right when America was developing the semiconductor overall ecosystem, Europe was right there with them. I mean, it all started with vacuum tubes, and it then moved into semiconductors and everything, right? So Europe was also a major manufacturer of vacuum tubes. They needed internally for themselves as well, and that's how it all started. But I think the key difference would be that because of their good ties with American companies, it was easier for these American companies to set up shop in Europe, and it is a capital intensive business to start a semiconductor firm, start manufacturing and set it up. And Americans were already doing it, and they were better at it, and Europe had to play catch up at the beginning. So at that point of time, all governments, so I mean most of, I mean at least the UK government and the France government, they started with the fact that since there are already good companies out there, they were not as incentivized to start their own semiconductor manufacturing, because they were already getting what they wanted, and all this trade deficit was not something they were worried about as much, because I mean they were allied with the US, and they just could start using whatever US had. So that is how it started. But eventually, even European companies started understanding the importance of the role that chips played, and how important they were for the military, and overall how they were the base of technology. And right now, I would say there are a good set of European companies that are doing pretty well. You have Philips that is there. You had SGS, I mean French company SGS, which now has merged multiple different times and has become ST Microelectronics. You have German Infineon Semiconductors, which makes which is where I worked at, and they make they are the number one in automotive chips and all. And even the UK had ARM that we have talked about. IP licensing, ARM used to do very well, and the Netherlands has ASML, which is if you look at the semiconductor space, if we were talking about TSMC, not many people knowing it. ASML stands equal to TSMC. It provides very important components which no other company in no other country can do. So over time, US has seen that competing in the mass manufacture market of the memory chips or logic chips was not where it was cut out for. Its labor costs were high, and its setting up costs were high. And they were all, it was not the European Union that was working as a whole. It was just multiple different countries coming up with their own incentivized programs, and they didn't simply have enough market to focus on semiconductors and build on that. So eventually, they started figuring out different places where each country could have its own competitive advantage. And some countries focused a lot on research. There is this particular firm in Belgium, IMEC Belgium, which is a research institute, which is where every single semiconductor company goes to for cutting edge research. You have TSMC working with IMEC Belgium, you have ASML, you have Intel, everyone literally works with IMEC Belgium to figure out what is the next. Right now, we are at probably 3 nanometer size of a transistor. Where do you go after this? 10 years down the line. So this kind of research is where a lot of European countries are actually working on closely. And you also have ASML that I was talking about, where they are the only companies, they are the only company in the world which are able to make lithography machines that are able to make the transistors as small as 3 or 4 nanometers. The machines are called extreme ultraviolet lithography machines. And basically, what they do is they take the blueprint and they print it onto a chip. They use specific masks, use very expensive, very complicated lasers, such that they're able to put it onto a chip the size of your fingernail. So it very very complicated process, and even for ASML, it was not able to be done alone. It needed 15 to 20 years of funding from governments, from companies like Intel owning a stake and funding, and it needed like 150 different products from multiple different companies or across the world, and each machine also costs like 180 to 200 million almost. So this level of complexity, competitive advantage that the Netherlands now has, and this is what they chose to focus on instead of going the mass market play like most of the East Asian companies did.
No, I would. So again, Amit, it worked perfectly like comparative advantage based specialization theory would say. So in a world where this geopolitics and semiconductor industry is not politicized, Europe is placed quite well. So because they have certain points in that industry where if other nation states were to do something to them, they also have critical nodes which they control, and they can again use that as a way to bargain. So they do have that option available to them. But labor costs are high. Running industry in Europe is not that easy. So all those are the weaknesses, so to say, if you think of a very extremely politicized semiconductor supply chain. So that's where their weakness lies. But yeah, they do have, like Abhiram said, right, the beauty of the photolithography machine is also something to be studied. It's so damn complicated, requires 2 planes to carry that one machine and cost $180 million a pop. But just the technical brilliance of making that work is also really really amazing. I mean, I'm not even going into that details, but it is something of it's a human marvel, and again it got created in Europe. So Europe does have one instrument which no other nation state has.
Yeah, and in your book, of course, you've got a narrative about how whenever the state tried to do something, like when it tried to put together things like Esprit and the Eurochip program, they kind of failed for different reasons, which you've sort of detailed out. But you've also got these great success stories like ARM, like IMEC, like ASML. And by the way, I discussed ASML in an episode of Everything is Everything with Ajay Shah called The Three Globalizations. We shall link that from the show notes. And in that, I asked him a question which I will now ask you, Pranay, and let us see if, as an expert in this field, you know the answer to this. And the question is this, that if you recorded the sound of one of ASML's machines and played it in such a way that it gave you deep sensuous pleasure and made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, what would you call the experience?
ASMR.
ASMR by ASML. Well done. Well done. Cracked it. I'm sure you've seen the episode.
No, I haven't. Okay. I haven't. Yeah.
Yeah. No. Okay. That's quite wonderful. And like you said, a perfect illustration of comparative advantage and so on. And really
I thought you were going to go with the bargaining chip reference or something like
Oh
that.
my God, don't get me started, Pranay. Don't get me started. You don't know how this will end. But yeah, that's a good one. Great minds think alike and fools seldom differ. So let's come to matters of national interest. I want to talk about India. What are we doing? And we've had various phases. I think you describe a total of three phases in which India has sort of been a participant in this whole game. Three versions: version one, version two, version three. So, give me a potted history of, India's role with semiconductors and how we've sort of thought about it.
Yeah. So again, the first version we call it by the government and for the government. So again, it was in that period where they thought government, only a government company can do this. So they tried a lot, and they eventually reached only a stage where you had companies which can do some small amount of manufacturing for space and for defense sectors, that too a small bit, nothing beyond that. We have no manufacturing facility in India which is at a commercial scale. So that was sort of the first version, and I've described the failures of that, comparing it to USSR and China's. The second version was when, by the time government realized that this is not matter for governments to solve, and 1991 liberalization had also happened. So thereafter the idea was, can the private sector sort of do this? And there, that stage, that version I call the unease of doing business, right? That was the period where there were a lot of attempts by companies to start things in India, also by MNCs to start some assembly, not even fabrication, but even assembly. But all of them, see, one thing we have to remember, this is a capital intensive and high gestation period industry, right? So if you start making a fab today, the first chip will come out of it only 3, 4, 5 years from now. So you'll start making money after 5 years. So you need to have an amazing amount of trust in the trade, business, policy environments, which Indian governments failed to provide for a long time. So at least in that golden period, 2004 to 2008, there was an attempt to start an assembly plant, but then the global financial crisis happened. So many companies backed off. Then in 2013-14, there were another couple of attempts, but by that time you also had the Vodafone case. So that made it very difficult for any company to do long-term investment of billions of dollars, scared about what the government might do next, right? Retrospective taxation and things of that sort. So my assessment is that it is because of poor tax policies, and also there was no GST. I know GST has other problems, but GST at least is a uniform tax structure. Otherwise, imagine you had to have, you needed to have your warehouses in each of the states, and for a globalized industry like this, it would have been even more difficult. So those tax problems, policy uncertainty, and also the fact that we started increasing import duties from 2015-16, that again makes it difficult because you need to import to export more in this industry as well. And that is again something that you couldn't do. So this was the second version, where because of businesses running a large scale business being difficult, none of these companies came up. And I would again draw parallel to, it's not just in semiconductors, again nothing special in semiconductor assembly. That's been India's weakness in other large scale manufacturing as well. I mean, we've started doing poorly even in textiles, right? So it's not just semiconductors. So that was the second version. Now version 3 is what the government is attempting now, and it all started again because of COVID-19 and the pandemic, that led the government to again start thinking that, can we again start something anew here? The difference is that this time, one, the Indian market itself has grown. So now there is a demand which is local as well, which was not available 10 years ago. There are also companies like Apple, etc., which are doing some electronics assembly now. So probably they would want to do some get some chips assembled here as well, right? It's in their interest to have a local ecosystem, not so much in the, even if the government wishes or not, they would want to do that. So that is the new force which led the new schemes for doing something in semiconductors, and the government is trying to do things across the value chain, in design, in manufacturing, in assembly, which was not the case earlier it were piecemeal arrangements. The third thing government did is, because policy and trade environments have still not improved significantly, the government is putting capital investment upfront, not as a reimbursement. Earlier it was that you set up things, and once you have set things up, we'll reimburse 50% of the costs or whatever do you. But which company will wait for 5 years and on this promise, right? So now, in order to get over that, the government has said that for every rupee you put in, we will back you up with another rupee. So that's a new strategy which probably will encourage some sort of assembly. But the fact that for the first company which has agreed to do this is an assembly company from the US, which is called Micron, even they there are roughly 70% capital subsidies which have been given to an assembly firm, which just illustrates how difficult it is to do business in India and to do large scale manufacturing. So that still remains. And the way I see it is that government probably has three priorities in mind. One is to double down on your comparative strengths, which is currently design, because human capital intensive process, you require large number of engineers, which we have. So almost every top 10 semiconductor company by revenue has a design center in India, a fabulous company by revenue. So we already have that ecosystem for doing well in design. Also doesn't require you huge capital investment, etc. So that could be one aim. Double down on comparative strength. The second goal could be to actually reduce your big major vulnerabilities. So for example, none of our defense equipment will have chips made in India. So maybe at some point of time you need to have things which are developed in India. So that would be the second objective. The third objective would probably be to reduce trade dependence on China. Now, this is an objective I don't agree with, but in stated policies of the government, this is an objective. And they want to reduce the amount of chips, etc., which are coming in from China. So these are the three goals. Based on these three goals, they have tried to do things across the supply chain. My assessment is that they have gotten the priorities wrong. First of all, we should not worry about trade dependence on China, but we should focus on the other two goals, and maybe doubling down on comparative strength should be the priority instead of trying to build a fab and reduce vulnerabilities today. Maybe you should start, maybe try to get a fab. If it happens, it's good. If it doesn't happen, it's fine. But you will develop expertise in this only 30-40 years down the line. So if you start a fab today at the trailing edge, maybe we'll get to a reasonable stage 30-40 years later, just like Taiwan took such a long time. But comparative strength is design. So I think the goal should be, can you develop more capable engineers? Can we have Indian engineers probably running semiconductor industries across the globe, not just as engineers, but also as plant managers who can manage this complex supply chain, etc. So if we develop that expertise, India will have some leverage in this supply chain from a geopolitical perspective.
Marvelous, but I must protest, Pranay. Protest that you have let our nation down by saying we don't have fabs. We have fabs. I can totally imagine an American from Silicon Valley coming here and going to Fab India and saying, show me the chips. Why do you have these long shirts? Show me the chips. What are you doing? But what I'm going to try now, before I ask you my next question and ask you to elaborate on the present and the future, is sort of try and sum up in my own head this whole story in really simple language as I understood it, so you can tell me if I understood it correctly and fill in the gaps, that there is this period of great innovation in the US, and the transistor is invented there in 1947 in Bell Labs, and from there you get this whole semiconductor revolution happening. And this is given a fillip by the ideological imperatives of the Cold War. There is what you call this creative insecurity, which is therefore a drive towards innovation for geopolitical reasons. A state pumps in a lot of money, and you have this whole industry taking place. At the same time, there are different things happening in East Asia, and the US, as part of its containment policy of containing communism in China and North Korea, decides to support Japan and South Korea and Taiwan. And initially they start at the bottom of the value chain, and they're doing things like assembly, and gradually as the years go by, they kind of move up. They do this in different ways. They have different policies. They have different kinds of success with it, but they all move up. And Taiwan becomes really critical because they become the fabricating powerhouse of the world, to the extent that if Taiwan is to suddenly be shut off from the rest of the world, the world would basically be screwed. It would be a huge humanitarian disaster, because a lot of things would just stop right there. And so there is a danger that what if China wants to invade Taiwan? And Taiwan, of course, used to be in Japanese hands at one time. China gave it to Japan in 1895 when the first Sino-Japanese war took place, and they lost Taiwan there. Second World War, they kind of get it back, but then Taiwan goes off on its own. That's where the nationalist government is, and there's always sort of this collision. So for political reasons, as much as anything else, China would love to invade Taiwan and get away with it. And that is the nature of the world's worry now, because suddenly the other countries look at what is going on, and they realize that sure, we have this incredibly intricate supply chain which is miraculous and which has delivered so much value to the world, but what is a feature can also become a bug, because any part of this can break down, such as China invading Taiwan, or natural disaster strikes a place, there are earthquakes in Japan or whatever. You can't afford any part of it to break down. So what do we do? And a lot of nationalistic thinking kind of comes into play, and India has been peripheral all this while. It's made clumsy attempts to be part of the game, but it isn't. And now your argument is we can be part of the game if we focus on comparative advantage like Europe did, which is in terms of design. But otherwise, whatever national policy has to be set, I mean, I would have a question in terms of you have to think long term for something like this to work out, and who's doing the long term thinking, and who is to do it? Is the state to kind of do it, or are independent players to follow incentives that are before them and to make investments accordingly? Like you point out, in China, the idea of creating national champions simply did not work out. What worked out was allowing FDI and allowing investors to come in and invest. And for that, the question is that you need a conducive business environment. And after all that has happened in the last couple of decades, is foreign capital really going to trust India to that extent again? What can we do to build up that trust? So this is sort of the overall picture that I see. So now I want you to talk about the present and the future, because it seems to me that at one level this is now a fundamental shift in geopolitics, that even though we have an outright war going on and Russia, Ukraine are fighting and all of that, the age of outright wars is kind of over. And you could argue with so much globalization, even trade wars is completely different in nature from what it used to be. And now today technology has kind of come to the forefront. So tell me a little bit about this, both, when you guys started noticing this. Pranay, you said in 2019 you first became aware that, fuck, I have to start thinking about semiconductors again. So take me through your sort of, like, did I state this more or less correctly? What would you add to this? And, give me a sense of where we stand now, because what has happened in the last 3 or 4 years, where do we stand now? What are all these different stakeholders involved? How are they thinking about this? What are the things that they are doing?
Right. So I think you had the summary spot on. I will just add one element to this on the Taiwan angle, right? So the interesting angle there is, again, TSMC, the speciality about it is that it has mastered this recipe to produce those chips at minimum loss, right? So if you have there's something called a wafer. So again, another chips and wafers. So there's a wafer which is sort of you can think of it as a pancake, and there are chips on top of it, right? Now what happens is, Taiwan, you can, on a wafer, you will have some chips which will work perfectly, but some, because the production process is so complex, they won't work as you desire it to be. So you need companies to develop the perfect recipe so that the yield is high, right? So most chips on that wafer will work, and hence your profitability will be more. That's what TSMC has been able to do better than any other company. Now, if you think of it, this recipe doesn't come from some machine or anything. It's because of the processes they have put in place, the human ingenuity and the learning that they have done over 30-40 years. So if that resides, it's a knowledge problem and not a machine capital problem. It means it can move to other countries as well, right? So that's why what you're seeing is that Taiwan's and TSMC's option is that you try to establish bases in other countries now. So US is attracting TSMC to set up base there. Japan has already in starting a TSMC plant there. So the hope is that even if China were to invade Taiwan, there will be other alternatives which will come up by Taiwanese engineers and TSMC engineers just going to other places as well. So that is sort of the hope. And the flip side to this is, even if China were to invade Taiwan and take control of all these machines at TSMC, it's very unlikely that they will actually control the supply chain like Taiwan did, because TSMC itself is dependent on so many equipments from ASML and materials from Japan, which will stop to China if China were to invade Taiwan. So in that sense, I think Taiwan is important, but its importance to the semiconductor industry is overstated in the politics of today. So a lot of nation states are precisely doing industrial policy because of this reason. But I think other alternatives will come up. There will be a shock, but it is not as if China will occupy Taiwan and there will be a TSMC operated by China, and then all countries have no option but to just buy from this China-owned TSMC. I don't think we'll get to that world. So, but nevertheless, this is the narrative, and that is driving a lot of, and also this narrative is beneficial to the local semiconductor players, right? So Intel would want to say this to the US government: give me money, otherwise this will happen in Taiwan. And that is also driving a lot of industrial policies in every country. So the present is coming to what you were talking about, the present. So that is where we are at this moment, where a lot of nation states are trying to pump in money. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, China, India, Europe, US, all of them want their own local semiconductor industry to a certain extent, at least more than what it is now. So, and a lot of them are focusing on fabrication because Taiwan is the cited reason, right? So that is one angle that most countries are trying. Coming to your India point, I would say that I agree. The better way would be, one, to integrate with the global supply chain, right? So we are not part of RCEP. We are not part of any trade formation. That means that a lot of the imports and trade with the world is difficult, and that makes it difficult for any MNC to set up shop here if the products that will be made here are not competitive at a world level, right? That is one thing that Indian government has to do. And tax policies, trade policies, business policies are still not settled. That is one thing which governments should focus on. But always governments like nice shiny things. Buildings like a fab are always nice jewels that governments would want. So industrial policy comes very naturally to many governments, and that's where we are on that path in all countries, including in India. Yeah, that's where the present is. I'll come to the future later.
So I have a follow-up question. To buttress your point, I'll quote from your book where at one point, in fact, you quote TSMC chairman Mark Liu, where you say he went on record saying that, quote, if China were to take over Taiwan, it would find TSMC's facilities unusable because a secret ingredient is human capital and real-time international collaboration with companies for material, software, hardware, and know-how. Stop quote. And this reminds me of perhaps the most tweeted sentence of the last week, which was again during the OpenAI controversy, where at one point, to show solidarity with Sam Altman, all of these OpenAI people who were threatening to leave tweeted out, quote, OpenAI is nothing without its people, right? So, that again speaks to the same point. And my question to you then is that surely the secret for any country which wants a leg up in this game is attract the best people, figure out ways to attract the best people, create network effects the same way that, Silicon Valley would at one point in time, and everything will kind of work out. And you create and I don't think we are attracting the best people. In fact, I think in some ways we are driving good people away. But to attract the best people, you want to, have good tax policies. You want to figure out what kind of incentives can make, NRIs, Indians in Silicon Valley, for example, return here the same way as Abhiram said that, in Taiwan and in South Korea, a lot of Taiwanese and South Korean diaspora actually went back to be part of their country because living standards were better and they felt, hey, let's come here and build our own country and it's a good life anyway. And to quote your colleague Nitin Pai, the best foreign policy is a rising GDP. So what do you sort of think about that thought of it, that perhaps we pay a lot of attention to all these intricate details, key, where is the fabrication, where is the assembly, where is this, where is that, but one key part of the element is just figure out ways to get the best people to where you are, create those conditions, and the rest will happen and comparative advantages will present themselves.
No, I agree to that. And in fact, many countries are now thinking of having something called silicon visas, and it's not visas made of silicon, but visas for the semiconductor industry to attract a lot of, talent in this area to their own countries. For example, US, the bottleneck that US faces today is not money. They are pumping in huge amounts of money, but the bottleneck is really talent. They don't have enough people to work in the new fabs and new companies which will come up. That will eventually, and Chinese people can't go there because this industry is now deemed to be geopolitically sensitive, so it will become difficult for them to. So which is the country from where many people will go? It will be India, right? Now it benefits the US, probably benefits India as well if these people come back, but this is how it will play out in many countries. Human talent, I think, will be a very important instrument of statecraft and also a domain of geopolitical contestation to attract the best human talent. In some cases, it might also be to make human talent movement difficult. For example, because of China, Japan, Australia relations, now Japan is thinking that there are certain strategic sectors in which Chinese students coming into Japan should be kept away. So that is the flip side of it. But so human talent is a really important ingredient. It will in the future also become a lot more contested, and you need to attract the best people here in any country. That will be important for many people in this industry.
Let's talk about the future now. In your book, you have this fascinating section on 4 likely trends in, geopolitics regarding the tech wars. So, so tell me a little bit about those likely trends, that are going to come up and how foreign policy is if going to be impacted or going to change because of that.
Yeah, a few trends that sort of I see going ahead in the future is one, as we see, trade wars are largely going to be technology wars, and that you also mentioned because nuclear weapons make geopolitical conflict, big large scale wars unlikely. Similarly, there's so much benefits to globalization that complete decoupling is also unlikely. For example, US China, the trade is still going on. There is not much of a dip in that as of now. But the thing that is different is in technology domains, nation states are still not clear what are the actual losses of going down this path. So they are trying, and I think it will lead to losses for everyone, but every nation state is trying, and it is also attractive because the narrative is that technology is important for national power. So why shouldn't you do more things domestically? Why shouldn't you decouple, right? So that's why you will see that there will be some decoupling in high tech areas. It might be at the level of materials, machines, humans, or ideas, but the precise pathway will depend on the technology, whether it is AI or whether it is semiconductors, but that might differ. But this decoupling is something we'll see for the next few years. The second trend that I see is that because of this aggressive national competition, there might be some non-linear breakthroughs, right? So if the flip side, as we saw discussed again, is there is more creative insecurity. So there are nation states which are trying to invest more and more into science and technology. Because China has restrictions put on it, they might try alternative ways to achieve the same goal, right? So there might be some non-linear breakthroughs which wouldn't have happened in the past but might happen in this decade. The third one is there is probably going to be higher alignment between private high technology players and the national governments, and that again is happening because of the politicization of technology areas, right? So for example, Intel just a few years ago was happy to invest in China, to start fabs in China, but once this idea happened since 2019, it has stopped its investments, further investments, and it now, because the government is ready to pay a lot more money back home, they are doing a lot more things either in Europe or in US itself. So this kind of alignment between private high-tech players and their national governments is more likely. Earlier you didn't have, right? We had 30-40 years of a period where you just said private companies followed profit, followed whatever nation state and environment gave them the best value, and that was fine. The national government's positions were not that important. But in these high-tech areas, including semiconductors, it is likely that these private players will now need to seek some export control waivers, or some sort of alignment will be necessary. And the fourth one is that actually we might see selective international cooperation in semiconductors and other areas, but something which is subject to geopolitical considerations. So for example, US-China high-tech collaboration will probably decline, but US-India collaboration or US-Japan collaboration might actually increase, because even US realizes that you can't build everything at home. That's the story of globalization. And the way I put it is that plurilateral cooperation is a necessity and not a choice in all these areas. So you will need to have some PCB manufacturing happen in India and some materials happening in Japan. So you might see more international cooperation, but it will be sort of bracketed by geopolitical favorability as well. And that's why you're actually seeing a lot of action on the technology front in the foreign policy realm. So, the national security advisors of USA and India meet. If you see the joint statement, generally joint statements of NSAs will do something against terrorism, etc. But if you see this readout, the latest readout, there were words like hackathon and joint startup ecosystems and things like that. So that it signifies change. When the Indian PM went to US, and their readout also, the first line of that is all about semiconductors and what India can do. It's very unusual to see that kind of thing in a US-India geopolitical foreign policy talk. And then Quad, again, something that India, US, Japan and Australia are doing. There again, technology and semiconductors are an important item of discussion. There is a semiconductor supply chain initiative by the Quad as well. So it shows that there will be more international cooperation as well, provided some geopolitical conditions are met. So these are sort of four trends that I foresee. going ahead.
So I have a question for Abhiram, but first I want to kind of seek a clarification from you, Pranay. What is the difference between multilateral and plurilateral? The first time I've heard that term.
Yeah, I think this is a term that government of India others use. Multilateral, when we mean organizations even like the UN, right? Very big one tent organization where all countries come up. Plurilateral are smaller groupings, so you might just have 4, 5, etc.
Fair enough. So here's my question for you, Abhiram, that we've spoken about semiconductor geopolitics and semiconductor geoeconomics, but the third arm of all this, no pun intended, even if I said arm, but the third arm of all this is semiconductor technology, and there I find that there are also unknowns there, and maybe some of them are not quite so unknown. Like you write about the open source revolution there, like how so far chip design's been dominated by x86 and ARM, and now you have the open source alternative called RISC-V, which has been developed by the University of California. No licensing fees. China loves it because nobody can stop them from using it. It's public. It's open source. You point out that in terms of EDA, also, right now there's an oligopoly. But even here, there was an open road project launched in 2018 with support from DARPA and so on, and that again, is exciting. Plus, you speak about how there are possibilities of looking beyond silicon and maybe taking a big step up there as well. So tell me a little bit about this also, that what are the kind of developments which are happening, what are the trends happening, and what are the possibilities. I'm not asking you to predict what will happen, but just thinking in terms of what could happen in different directions that could change the game a little bit.
Yeah, you were talking about open source and using other materials and all, right? So what we see here is there could be new players coming into the picture, and existing players who are at a disadvantage, eliminating that disadvantage basically. Like so there are two type of architecture that are mainly used: the ARM based architecture and x86. So Intel chips are mostly x86 and ARM is mostly in mobile phones. And 3-4 years ago, Apple famously moved from an x86 to an ARM based architecture, and their performance went up multifold. Both of these are, x86 is owned by Intel and used by AMD, while ARM is owned by UK based firm. UK based. It is UK based basically. So both of them are not allied particularly to China, and they have no incentive to be providing licensing to China as well. So if you look at it that way, an open source alternative to both of these fits China's needs perfectly well. It doesn't have to rely on either of these countries, and that is one way. That is one way to actually move forward without having to depend on the US or UK. The same goes with EDA tools. EDA tools are basically software which are required to create the blueprint. I mean, there are billions of transistors there, so I mean, you can draw it out with a drafter. So you will definitely need some kind of software which will do multiple computations to give you the perfect scenario, the perfect placement of the chips. And the two main players are Cadence and Synopsys. Both of them are US based, and no other company has been able to come close to that level of domination. And any chip design firm which work at the cutting edge level, it will definitely have to use either of these softwares. And this is where again China will have to depend on countries like the US. At least there are open source alternatives coming up. The open road was by DARPA again, but we do not know the level to which they are able to perform. It is just in the starting phases, and very basic chips will be able to be made there. But it's still a long way to go, but it is a start. That is what China is looking at, and it is also investing significantly to make open source EDA tools available for everyone as well. And this will give China a strategic advantage where it was previously lacking behind. But I'm not going overly positive with both of these. They might be able to help out at the beginning, but there's still a lot of work to be done over the next couple of years for them to actually reach a stage where they become as commonplace as like Linux operating system, which is open source or something like that. So that is regarding the open source part of it. And other is we were talking about silicon. So we right now silicon is the best material for semiconductors, but that might not be the case in the future. There is a lot of research going on for silicon carbide, graphene, And in fact, the UK has a separate silicon carbide zone that is coming up with all companies only focusing on research on silicon carbide. Even India has invested significantly. Tata has invested in silicon carbide as well. So you can see, I mean, at least for different parts of chips. It might not be for general purpose chips, but for power electronics, which derive a lot of power, silicon carbide might replace silicon, and you might actually see India, taking an advantage there. These are the places where each country is trying to focus and get a competitive advantage, and this might change the order of things and which company is favorably seen as well.
Yeah, I think just to add to this, open source is quite an interesting space to look at from a political angle. One, it also benefits India, right? Anything made open source benefits entire world, including India, and it benefits China as well. So actually, now the US government is reconsidering that whether there should be restrictions on open source going to China, which defeats the purpose of open source
Like, how
itself.
do you even do that? That's
Yeah, yeah. So but they're trying to think of putting export controls, etc. So all these are new things which we are literally finding out as we go ahead. I mean, closing open source, what does that, but it's being thought of. And this open source idea is happening throughout the supply chain. For example, EDA tools also, like we discussed, you mentioned, then also you discussed in specific blocks, like finding alternative to ARMS, which is RISC-V, but it is also happening at the fabrication level. So for example, right now what happens is that fabrication process is quite complex, and the files which are required to optimize that process are called the PDK files, process design kit, and those are only shared with specific companies which work with these fabs over time to fine tune that process. Now there are other companies which are saying that why don't we open source these files as well, so that anyone should be able to actually produce the final chip, not just the blueprint but the final chip, after paying a cost for the machines, materials, etc. So Google, for example, is working with Skywater Fabs, which again, and they have started an open source program. So they had a pilot where you can submit your design and that will probably get fabbed and you can have a chip of yours. They had a limited run, but this is something again which will be an interesting area to watch out for going ahead. That's something to look out for. The other thing, Amit, I wanted to mention about from a political angle, my hunch is that nation states will realize that this self-sufficiency path that they are trying to achieve will be futile, and eventually go back to some understanding of some modus operandi with China, where trade goes on as it is. Generally what happens is semiconductor industry goes through these phases. There are exuberant phases and then suddenly it drops down. So right now it's in this exuberant phase because of what happened during the pandemic. Demand rised, everyone wanted more of it. So that's why people are okay to pump in more money, etc. But when the industry goes down, all these assumptions will be challenged, and many suppliers in US might say, if Chinese companies don't buy, we have no other buyer. So what else do you want us to do? We either survive by supplying to China or we don't. So those kinds of things might actually make us regress to the norm in some way, regress to the mean, and we might have some of these assumptions go away. But right now we are dominated by this thinking that every chip is strategically important and hence it needs to be made at as close to home as possible, and that's the dominant thinking in many governments as of now.
So I'd done an episode of Everything is Everything with my co-host there, Ajay Shah, and it's called The Three Globalizations. And we were sort of talking about the different waves of globalization, and my sort of lament, which he tried to assuage, but it still remains a lament, is that, we are becoming a less globalized world, that countries are increasingly becoming more populist and nationalist, and there's a danger of becoming more insular. And Ajay's point was that no, globalization isn't over. It has just changed in its nature nature, and the term he coined for it was a third globalization. And he said what is happening is that you still have the vast majority of countries being effectively globalized, trading with each other, playing the game. But a few countries which are treated as rogue or potentially rogue nations, like Russia, like China, there are conditions on them, and you use, economic statecraft and all the tools you have at your disposal to keep them out of the globalization game. And I'm not entirely convinced by that, and obviously Ajay was also being descriptive and not normative in saying this is the way things should be, but he was just being descriptive that this is where we are. And it seems to me that a term that I think you must have coined, because I haven't heard it before, it's in the book, silicon craft. And it seems to me that silicon craft is in a sense about this sort of third globalization, about this kind of economic statecraft that states carry out, particularly in the domain of technology and so on. So I first want you to confess to coining the term if you have indeed done so, and then tell me a little bit about how you would define it, and what are the kind of strategic objectives that countries can have. How do they, what are the things they can do? How do they do those things?
Right. Yeah, we have coined that term. And before we go to that, I'll just talk about that globalization point. I sort of agree with you largely that, in the sense, nation states will still see that today it has happened to Russia and China, so India will see tomorrow it might even happen to me. So it ends up creating a reality that you want to prevent, right? So even though US might be saying that this is only against rogue nations and not against you, nation states will respond to this from a different perspective. And big nation states are not going to be totally aligned with the US as well. So when you are in the middle, you will always think that, what if this happens to me? And that sparks more industrial policy in third countries apart from Russia and China. So that is a worrying sign that actually globalization's positives are largely being overlooked. But yeah, the hope again is that you will go down this path, realize probably that this is not the path early enough, and then go back to enjoying the benefits of globalization. But for now, it doesn't seem likely, at least in the next 2, 3, 4 years. It's my thing. So silicon craft, coming to that point, the way we thought of it is, try to imagine what are the kinds of instruments of geopolitics that might be used in this domain of semiconductors, right? So these can be political instruments or economic instruments, and what are nation states likely to use. Again, this is a descriptive framework, not normative one. So here there are sort of, if a nation state were to think of what would be the objective of doing anything in this domain, I could think of largely 4 objectives. One, you want to deny something to an adversary. The second goal could be to outpace the adversary. Third goal could be just to increase supply chain resilience, thinking that this is for the benefit of everyone. Let's make it more resilient. That's all. And the fourth one would be, maybe you want to use this to influence the minds and actions of the citizens in your adversary states. So if you think of these 4 objectives, we try to map out what are the instruments that nation states might use for achieving all these objectives. So for example, if the objective is denial, nation states might use instruments like sanctions and controls, which are already in place, or restrict the movement of semiconductor human talent. Third, they might actually have end-use restrictions, as in semiconductor trade goes as it is, but if some chips are used in military applications, then there will be restrictions. And fourth, there might be investment screening, as in if some US company wants to invest in China in semiconductors, there will be investment screening going ahead. In fact, US government is considering this as we speak. So each of these, we try to map out what are the underrated repercussions or unintended consequences of these actions, right? So for example, sanctions and controls, like US has said, US has put secondary sanctions. That is, US has said a Taiwanese company, TSMC, cannot supply chips to a Chinese company because the Taiwanese company finally uses some intermediate product from a American company, and US can do it because it has the power to do it. And now this works fine for TSMC. I mean, it puts a lot of strain on TSMC right now, but they are okay to absorb it because of the political realities. But it becomes difficult to sustain over time, right? So what if the industry goes down and TSMC is not able to survive? They will find some way to do a backroom deal with a Chinese company to transfer and make money there. So it is difficult to sustain. They have started it, but I don't know how long you can sustain this kind of sanctions and controls. Second, obviously restricting movement of human talent. If that were the goal, you will slow down a lot of technical progress in all of the industries, right? Talent interaction multiplies research, and that will stop. The third one, if there are end use restrictions, like let's say you don't want things to be done on the military front, again it is very difficult to police this, ensure that some chip doesn't get used in military and gets used elsewhere. So very difficult to maintain it, and in any case encourages the adversary to develop local capacity in that precise area, because you have denied access in that area. They know that it is vitally important to do something there. So that is one. So similarly, if this the second objective, let's come to that. If the objective is just to outpace the adversary, not to sort of deny, like then you could have certain instruments, like some nation states might want to do industrial espionage to gather secrets, or to do targeted poaching of talent from other companies. Or you could, on the positive side, if you just want to outpace an adversary, you don't need to indigenize everything. You just need to build partnerships with other players so that collectively you are ahead of your adversary rather than you yourself trying to do everything. The third one is indigenization and industrial policy, which every nation state is doing now. The fourth one could be economic coercion, which China is trying to coerce many companies, and that is something that nation states might use. The fourth one would be to encourage the movement of semiconductor talent, again with your partners, so that you can outpace the adversary. And the final one would be you just actually increase dependence of your adversary on your own ecosystem, such that your adversary is always 2 steps behind your own capabilities. So these are some kinds of instruments that we might see if the goal were outpacing the adversary. If the goal is increasing supply chain resilience and not denying or outpacing the adversary, then nation states might deploy actually promoting open source hardware kinds of instrument, or just to map supply chains such that if there were a shock in Taiwan due to geographical reasons or whatever, you have mapped the supply chains and you're not in the pandemic like situation where everyone is suddenly finding the reality. If you have mapped things, you can put mechanisms in place to absorb that sudden shock. And the last one, which appeals to me a lot, is again, if you want to increase supply chain resilience, build partnerships to create some resiliency in the supply chain, instead of thinking a lot of doing that at home in every other country. So this is how I would sort of map it, and we were trying to develop this framework. We don't have a prediction on which of these will be used, but we can definitely see a trend that we are seeing a lot of the more self-sufficiency kinds of instruments being used a lot now. But we've tried to put this framework to highlight that there are other instruments available which nation states can deploy, and that don't amount to you always trying to do everything at home.
Fabulous, extremely enlightening. And I should clarify to my listeners that, as they know, I don't like using jargon, but I've used a little bit of it myself. So I'll just clarify what I mean by those terms, where, we use descriptive and normative. And by descriptive, I mean, the world as it is, and by normative, the world as it should be, right? So often we'll be describing something and it might seem to an outsider that we are endorsing it, but we are usually just giving an explanation and not a justification. So that's important to point out, about that the descriptive is super important. To understand, to know what to do, to know what is the right way of action, you have to know the world and understand the world. So the descriptive is super important, and then later you can get to the normative and say, we should do this, we should do that. And what I loved about your book so much is that descriptively it is incredibly rich, and you don't you stay in the opinion of facts and analysis and etc etc. There's no hectoring at all. No, so two sort of final questions for you guys, and each of these final questions is for both of you. And the penultimate one is that if we now look into the future and we focus only on how this game is going to play out and what its consequences are, which is geopolitics in the semiconductor space, if I ask you to look 10 years ahead, what is a best case scenario you would love to see, and what is a worst case scenario you're really scared of? Abhiram, let's start with you.
Yeah, so best case scenario would be going back to the level of cooperation that each country had already had, having tariffs down and international trade agreements set up so that there is zero customs and export and import fees. But the worst case scenario is where you see two different silos. Basically, China is trying to do everything on its own already right now, and it has a sizable set of population as well, which it will exclude from others, and it will try to be self-sufficient on its own, while the other countries will also have to do the same. This would be a blow for both of them. There is less transfer, and each has to do it separately, and the price of each chips would also be increasing. Yeah, so I would say the siloing would be the problem.
Yeah, to add, I agree with the best case scenario, actually pre-pandemic world with some corrections to absorb, to make things resilient, and that government role will be there at least to map the supply chains, encourage companies, because many of these companies will not know who their suppliers are. It's such a complex supply chain. So mapping that might be a role for governments. So that might be the most positive scenario, where we realize that the pre-pandemic world trade was the best way with some corrections. And the worst case is where you will have actually very high consumer prices. Very high prices lead to lower demand. Lower demands will lead to lower sales made. Lower sales mean lower revenue, and lower revenue will lead to lower R&D. So you will actually have stalling of technological progress because of the overt politicization of this area and the entire geopolitics around it. So I think that to me is the scary scenario. So you will lose out on the gains that you have had. You might not have the next generation chip which might make Chat GPT 20 possible, right? Or something like that. So that is something to worry about. I will think I'll answer this question from the Indian lens as well, right? What would be the positive case from the Indian lens? And so maybe 10 years down the line, the positive case for me from the Indian lens would be that we probably have one fab which starts up, and through private investment, some government incentive, and India starts learning this process. We won't get to an expert stage, but maybe you carve out a specialization in that. So for example, Abhiram was saying you don't need to play the game that TSMC is playing. There are some compound semiconductors, there are other kinds of lower cost chip fabrication which India can start off with and occupy a space there. So that is a best case scenario in fabs. If the best case scenario in design would be that the semiconductor talent across the world in most companies is Indian, and probably some of them return, they start their own industry companies in India. I try to think of hardware in India being where software in India was 10 years ago, actually, where you didn't have products in software 10 years ago in India, but you had a lot of talent here. So eventually we got to a stage where products are also Indian. Maybe 10 years down the line, that might happen in hardware as well. So that's sort of the most positive scenario. The negative worst case scenario is actually where Indian government tries to do all this without actually making running business easier. So you have a fab starting and then it flops, and that will just mean that government will not want to touch this area for next many years and next decade. And then you will be in a situation when all companies are spooked, and just like what happened with the Vodafone case, and no one wants to invest in this area. So that is the scary scenario for India.
See, Pranay, this is why you're such a frequent guest on this show, because I ask you one question, you answer that question, and you answer another one as a bonus. And that was a damn good question about
Sorry.
India. You know, no, it's great because as soon as I asked that when Abhiram was talking, I said, shit, yaar, India ke bare mein bhi पूछना चाहिए था, but it's as if you read my mind. And at this point, I will tell you a story of what happened to me many years ago when I was a poor student and used to travel by buses. So once I entered a bus, और मैं वहाँ बैठा था, and I noticed this very unusual thing that the conductor half the time तो he is doing what he should do, giving tickets, taking money. The other half the time वो back seat पे बैठ के he is recording a podcast with someone. So I went to him and I said, boss, what are you doing? What is your job? He said, see, half the time I'm a podcaster. You could say I'm a semi-podcaster. So I said, the other half, what are you?
Semiconductor.
There you go. Well done. I'm sorry. I couldn't help that. So that's terrible, isn't it? But luckily it's come right at the end. So only the true believers have stayed around. My final question for both of you, and it's slightly different form for each of you because Pranay has been on before. But Abhiram, since it's your first time, my last question to you will be to give my listeners and me recommendations of books, music, films that you love and that you love so much that you want to share them with the world. Not just related to semiconductors or this field, though that is welcome, but just generally what makes you happy.
Okay. I actually spend a lot of time listening to the seen and the unseen and all things policy and everything. So I would definitely recommend just taking up any episode of this podcast. That would be very informative and very helpful. I especially like
Including this
Karthik
one.
Muralidhar and stuff.
Including
Yeah,
that's very
definitely
meta.
this one. Yeah. So regarding books, I think we were already discussing. We had talked about two different books here. The Chip War and Paper Tigers and Hidden Dragons. So those were two books that we had to go through, and both of them were amazing books. And regarding movies, I am a very massy kind of person. So I like proper, pulpy Indian movies. So I love Jawan actually. So anyone who's not seen, I came here and saw it, and I would want to watch it again as well. So that would something I would recommend.
Thanks so much, and thanks so much for the kind words about the show as well. Pranay, you've already in different episodes recommended different things, so I'll ask you a more narrow question in the sense that in recent months, what are the things, whether they are books or films or conversations or whatever, which have really sparked your mind and made you think in new ways and sort of given life to your brain, as it were?
Quite a bit of things, but one thing I have started reading a lot more is fiction. I know last time when we discussed, Terry Pratchett is one I have started reading a lot. So that is something quite enjoyable, especially all the series which focus on government and policy. There are a lot of those novel series as well. The Patrician.
He came up with the immortal phrase semiconductors all the way down. Okay, never mind, carry on. Yeah, Terry Pratchett fans will get that.
Yeah. So, but so that is one thing that I've quite enjoyed. The other thing that I'm trying to explore a lot more is the intersection of evolutionary biology and human societies. So trying to read a lot of work of Sapolsky, of Joe Henrich. So those are some things which probably will answer some of the questions about why societies function the way they do. So that is another interest area that I want to learn more about.
So, guys, once again, congratulations on a wonderful book. I'd recommend to all my listeners that they read this. It's extremely readable and made me just a little bit smarter. But because my memory is so bad, I will be a little bit less smart again. But hopefully, learning is always 2 steps up and 1 step down. So, thanks so much for coming on the show. This was great, and more power to both of you.
Thanks so much for hosting this wonderful conversation, Amit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amit.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode, head on over to your nearest bookstore online or offline and buy When the Chips Are Down by Pranay Kotasane and Abhiram Manchi. Superb book. You can follow Pranay on Twitter at Pranay Kotas. You can follow Abhiram at Manchigaru. We'll link these from the show notes. You can follow me on Twitter at Amit Verma, AMITVARMA. You can browse past episodes of The Seen and the Unseen at seenunseen.in. Thank you for listening. Did you enjoy this episode of The Seen and the Unseen? If so, would you like to support the production of the show? You can go over to seenunseen.in/support and contribute any amount you like to keep this podcast alive and kicking. Thank you.